Nikki was not answering the door, was not answering the phone.
When she doesn't appear, people are surprised. She's usually very reliable.
I think it was just a shock because you don't expect that to sort of happen where you live.
Just unbelievable. It's like you're in a movie. It's not even happening to you.
Murder? What do you mean, murder?
When the police reviewed the CCTV footage, they saw a person entering the flats.
It's chilling. She's on her way to kill.
Letchworth, England's first garden city, is a rural town situated north of Hertfordshire.
Letchworth was founded by Ebenezer Howard at the start of the 20th century. He wanted people to move out of cramped conditions in places like London and come and live in the countryside.
Letchworth, for somewhere to live, is lovely, it's welcoming, it's rural, but within easy reach of both Cambridge and London. I'm getting older, but I still find it's a very safe place to walk around. I just feel it's a very comfy place to live.
I think people in Letchworth are really friendly. Often if you walk in, you know, they'll say hello.
Life in Letchworth is really good. Everybody's very friendly, can be very vibrant through the summer months. Very nice place.
Letchworth is a lovely place to live. Very quiet, very nice, no trouble at all. Wouldn't live anywhere else. Beautiful place.
And for 26-year-old carer Nikki Collingbourne, it was the perfect place to live and work while remaining nearby to her family.
We were like best friends, really. Not so much, we used to make a joke about her being my auntie because she was younger than me, but we were just like really close friends, like sisters, really, because we were of a similar age.
She always wanted children of her own, and I think that made her very childlike, but in a good way. And she worked with children as well, so.
Because she's so good with kids, like, amazing, like, just seeing family, anyone's children, even their friends' kids, she was brilliant with. So obviously, as I started having my children, she became quite involved, and we'd often spend weekends together away, with kids, without kids. She's just such a kind person.
Nikki was very funny, caring and loving. Everything about her. She was just a wonderful person. She'd drop anything to do anything for anybody.
Nikki's close family circle depended on her in their daily lives, and that included helping her mum and taking her to and from hospital appointments. But all that was about to change.
Nikki's mother was very ill. She was being treated in the Lister Hospital in Stevenage, which is about 7 miles away. Nikki's due to collect her, and when she doesn't appear, people are surprised.
Nikki usually does all the running around, going and picks her mum up, make sure she's got everything, and she had not answered her calls, which was obviously very unlike Nikki.
Nikki would never let anybody down on an appointment, never, unless it was absolute emergency.
By the afternoon, I was a bit really worried, so I just sent her a text and I just said, Nikki, if you need me, I'm here, blah, blah, and yeah. And then the next thing I know, her mum had rung me and said, have you seen Nikki? She hasn't turned up to pick me up from hospital. And I instantly knew. I knew something was not right. I went down, the car was there, so I knew she was in the flat. Shouting through the letterbox, like Leanne stuff was shouting through the letterbox, no response. But I know that Nikki was very down and depressed about her mum being poorly, and she was really worried that what was going to happen to her. And sometimes Nikki was the type of person that does need to be just left alone for a little while. It's very unusual for her not to contact people. So I thought, you know what, we'll give it a night.
But the next day, there is still no word from Nikki.
She's usually very reliable. Her family trust her, they rely on her. So they're concerned. Her half-sister obtains a spare key to her flat and goes round with other members of the family.
With Nikki not responding, her family let themselves into the flat. But nothing could prepare them for what they would find.
They walked into the kitchen, and in front of them, they saw Nikki on the floor in a pool of blood. Her left wrist had been slit.
They found Nikki laying on the floor, her face up, with there was just like a massive congealed blood running from Nikki's head, and yeah, you could see that she was dead.
Family members went down to her flat to see if she was okay, and obviously discovered her body. At that point, they immediately called the police.
My daughter phoned me up hysterical, saying, Nikki's dead, Nikki's dead, there's blood everywhere. And I just went hysterical on the phone, and then I was in shock.
Police immediately arrive on the scene to be met by a gruesome sight.
In this case, the senior investigation officer will be looking to preserve that scene, preserving and securing evidence.
Nikki is laying on the floor of her kitchen, fragments of a ceramic chicken-shaped pot surrounding her. A severe cut is across her wrist. Could she have had an accident or taken her own life?
It was so bizarre, and there didn't seem to be any particular reason for it.
It was suspected that Nikki had took her own life, but I knew that that wasn't the case. She'd never have done that. She loved life too much. She would never have left her mum and her family.
As Nikki's body is taken for a post-mortem, the tragic news travels fast through the close-knit community, alerting the local press to the scene.
When the police arrived, the area was cordoned off. There were police cars everywhere, officers in white suits from the forensic department carrying out checks. Local people at the shops and the flats were shocked by what had gone on.
It's not something you hear about in, you know, the area that you live. It's not something you expect on your doorstep.
She was so friendly with everybody around here. It was sad when we heard about what happened to her. She wouldn't hurt anybody. She was the most kindest person I'd ever known. It was devastating news.
When the post-mortem report comes in, the results are not clear-cut.
From the pathology reports, there's no one single injury that led to Nikki's death. It was inconclusive.
But the results do reveal Nikki's skull had been fractured. And it seems the broken ceramic chicken-shaped dish which had surrounded her body was involved.
So the pathologist said that the chicken dish would have been picked up by two hands and used with considerable force. Although it wasn't enough to fracture Nikki's skull, it certainly was enough to render her unconscious.
The police quickly realised that somebody else had been involved.
The pathologists have concluded that she died because of the violent actions of a third party.
No one could have predicted that this was going to happen. We just couldn't believe it. It was just so, it was like it wasn't even happening to us.
With the outcome from the post-mortem now in, the inquiry into Nikki's death changes focus.
She's been murdered.
In Letchworth, results from the post-mortem on 26-year-old Nikki Collingbourne has changed the course of the investigation.
They walked into the kitchen, and in front of them, they saw Nikki on the floor in a pool of blood. Her left wrist had been slit.
Chicken dish would have been picked up by two hands and used with considerable force. It certainly was enough to render her unconscious.
With a murder investigation now underway, police break the news to her grieving family.
I was at work. I got a phone call from my boyfriend at the time, and he just said, "You need to get home right now." He goes, "I can't really tell you anything I don't want to tell you right now." But I knew. And I was so panicky. When I got there, there was police everywhere. It was, not very good. And my children were there crying. My mum was there crying.
And I was like, murder? What do you mean, murder? I honestly didn't think, even in that moment, that it was murder.
Just unbelievable. It's like you're in a movie, it's not even happening to you. Yeah, everyone was just shocked, devastated.
News that Nikki's death is now being treated as a murder quickly spreads around the area.
When I first heard about the murder, I think it was just generally shock, because you don't expect that to sort of happen where you live.
I was really amazed, really surprised, because it's a really safe area, and it really shocked me.
It took a long, long time to take it in. We knew the relatives, you knew them, and so sorry for the family, you know.
With family and locals still trying to come to terms with the murder, the bigger question being asked is who would want to harm Nikki?
She works with children. That was just what she wanted to do for her whole life. Just work with children, be a mum, and, she had a great relationship with everyone.
I loved everything about Nikki, everything. She was just a beautiful person. There's nothing she wouldn't do for you. She'd cheer you up. She'd get you motivated, because I don't go out a lot. She'd come in, she'd do stuff for me. She's like the little sister I never had.
Her family was her life. And we saw her almost all the time. I'd open my door, my son would be gone into her house, and I wouldn't see him for days. Just to text her to make sure, is my son okay? And she's like, yeah, don't need to worry, he's here.
She literally brought so much joy to anybody that met her, really. She just kept us all together. She was the glue that kept both sides of the family together, really. She was just a really amazing, one of those people that you meet and you're like, wow, she was put on this earth just to care for people. She was just amazing.
I was honestly shocked when I found out who the victim was. So I honestly had no idea why anybody would want to harm her.
With no clues as to who would want to harm Nikki, forensic officers take a closer look at her flat, turning the block into a major crime scene.
Police officers in white suits were gathering vital forensic evidence. The whole scene had been cordoned off. It was a major crime in what was usually a quiet area.
A murderer will either leave something at the scene or take something away from the scene. So we're looking to preserve and secure that evidence. And that evidence will be DNA, fingerprints, blood, hair, fibres, etc. So that they're looking for the physical evidence. A forensic examination of the scene was carried out, and DNA, essentially blood, was found on the broken pieces of the chicken pot.
While the evidence is sent off to the laboratory for examination, further searching at Nikki's home uncovers something concerning.
A letter was found in Nikki's flat in which she'd written to her GP saying she was absolutely terrified.
The letter throws up more questions. Who could Nikki have been afraid of? And could this person be behind her untimely death?
Nikki, unfortunately, got a lot of threats, and Nikki was terrified. I've never, ever known anyone so absolutely terrified. I remember one night, she barricaded her door up.
Yeah, she was very withdrawn. She was just scared.
Police need to piece together Nikki's last known movements, including trying to ascertain whether anyone visited her.
There was no sign of a forced entry in the sense of, for example, the door having been levered or a broken window or anything of that kind. The only way that you could get to it, it was quite secure, was by entering the door to the common parts of the purpose-built block and then going up the stairs and onto the landing and approaching the door of Nicky's flat.
So when looking at a murder investigation, the priorities at the scene could be different for different murders. For example, a killer has to have got there and then gone away from the scene. So it could be fast track looking at the CCTV, it could be speaking to family members, or it could be house to house because somebody could have seen the killer leaving the scene.
All the entrance and the landing on the first floor were covered by CCTV cameras, and as it happens, the system had been recently improved, and once the police got access to the CCTV, they recovered a whole series of images of events occurring at the door of the flat between the Sunday evening when Nicky returned home and the Tuesday evening when members of her family finally let themselves in.
After accessing the CCTV footage, police spend hours trawling through the images.
When the police reviewed the CCTV footage, they saw a person entering the flats. That person was wearing a high-vis jacket.
The CCTV shows a figure in a ginger curly wig, large frame glasses, with a King Charles I beard and a high-vis jacket lumbering along the corridor.
The person is seen entering the flats just before 8:30 a.m. on Monday the 23rd of May and leaving just before noon, corresponding with the pathologist's time of death.
That person immediately becomes a person of interest because of the time they entered and left the flats. But also the CCTV showed that that person went to Nicky's door.
Who is the person on CCTV wearing a high-vis? Could it be a workman or a boyfriend?
When you've got the CCTV, you don't know who that is. However, you look into the victim and their background, and if you find out how a victim lived, you may find out how they died.
She didn't have a boyfriend, she was waiting for that one special person.
With police still at a loss, they turned to those close to Nicky.
The police called me up and asked me to go into the station to help them with something. But after I got off the phone to them, I was like, a bit like, well, I was the last person to see Nicky. Like, all these thoughts were, you don't even think you're going to think like that, but all these thoughts were running through my mind. I thought, I was the last person to see her, I was the last person to talk to her. What if they think it was me?
Me and Jodie had been called up on the Thursday or Friday by the police at the headquarters in Welling, and they said, oh, would you and Jodie, we want just you and Jodie to come and view some pictures for us. And we were like, oh, okay. And we were like, well, we don't really know anyone around here. We only know our family, so I don't know what we're going to find. Like, we just didn't know what we was going to expect.
So me and obviously Leanne drove there, and we got there and they separated us both. And they basically took Leanne into a room, and then took me into a room, and I didn't quite know what I was here to do. And they just like, we need to show you some CCTV images. Just say what you think, if you know the person, say.
And we kind of sat in this room and had a camera on us. I filmed the whole thing of me watching video footage of someone in a high-vis.
I honestly felt like passing out when I see it, like within 3 seconds of watching the clip. I actually had to stop halfway through watching it. I was in such shock. I was crying, screaming. I couldn't believe it.
And I was like, I don't even think that's a man. I think that's a female dressing up as a man. I knew straight away that Jodie was going to identify her.
I just knew that it was Yvonne.
The murder investigation into the death of Nicky Collingbourne has thrown up a suspect. A man seen entering Nicky's flat at the time of her death. But when CCTV is examined closely, family members recognise the person. And it's not a man.
When I see that first image of her dressed up the way she was, it just all hit me. I just knew that it was Yvonne.
But who is Yvonne?
So Nikki and Yvonne were sisters. There's a big age gap between about 27 years.
I first met Yvonne when I was dating her brother Paul, who obviously I later married, and we became friends. We used to go to the pub. Yvonne went to live in America, and basically I didn't have anything to do with Yvonne for years. She was estranged from the family.
Having moved to the US in the early 1990s, and due to their age gap, Yvonne and Nikki had not grown up together. But keen to get to know her half-sister, Nikki moved to America.
I did meet her when I went to America a couple of times. I kind of had my reservations about her, and she's quite in your face when she talks. She makes everything about her. She's quite manipulative.
She was quite boisterous. She would certainly punch you if she wouldn't think twice about it.
Despite the family's reservations, in 2015, when Yvonne came to visit family in the UK from the US, Nikki repaid the favour, letting her sister move in with her.
Everyone was just shocked to see her back in the UK, but at first we were happy to see her because she's part of the family.
The pair living together came as a surprise to family, since Nikki had shared something with them on her return to the UK.
Yvonne and Nikki's relationship was very strained when she came back because they'd had a big fallout before Nikki came back. And then obviously Yvonne followed about, I think it was a year later, but Nikki forgave her and they made it up, and that's how she ended up living with Nikki.
With Yvonne Kaler having been identified as the person in the CCTV, and with her being deemed the last person to see Nikki, and therefore a suspect, police need to ascertain what could have gone wrong in their relationship.
I have no doubt in my mind that Yvonne was jealous of Nikki and their relationship that she had over the years with their dad.
Yvonne was very jealous of the relationship that Nikki had with their dad because she obviously lived in America and Nikki lived in England, and she grew up with her dad, and I suppose, you know, she was in with all of us lot, and Yvonne didn't have that relationship with us. We only had that over the internet.
Because obviously Nikki felt obliged to have Yvonne there because they were sisters, and Nikki was very much a family person. Yvonne definitely manipulated her and used the fact that they were sisters.
Nikki and Yvonne Kaler's relationship was anything other than tranquil. It was difficult and tempestuous.
But could this strained relationship between the half-sisters have led to Nikki's death? In order to piece the puzzle together, police need to ask some questions. So make a decision.
Yvonne Kaler was arrested on the 25th of May, 2016. Once we got the suspect in custody, and we believe that is the killer, the clock is ticking. So we've got to do everything we can to get enough evidence for the CPS to authorise a charge. Because certainly in this case, if Yvonne Kaler hadn't been bailed, she was a risk to other people out there.
Because obviously they had Yvonne, they'd arrested her for Nikki's murder, but they had no evidence to hold her. They had this CCTV image, and DNA takes time to come back, so they couldn't actually hold her.
With Yvonne in custody, police trawl her mobile phone and laptop and discover she had been searching for flights.
The police discovered she was planning to drive to Spain and then fly out to the United States to meet her husband.
She was planning to flee the jurisdiction and fly back to America. Those arrangements had, as it were, begun in the immediate aftermath of Nikki Collingbourne's death.
She was at flight risk. We know she was planning to go back to the USA.
Her mobile phone revealed she'd even sent messages after news of Nikki's murder broke.
Yvonne Cayler was pretending to be as concerned and upset as every other member of Nikki's family. She sent a message to her husband in the United States saying, "Pray for Nikki, as I will."
While piecing together Yvonne's movements in the days leading up to Nikki's murder, further revelations come to light.
She had visited the costume shop where she acquired the wig and the disguise and the false beard the preceding week. So there'd been clearly an element of planning about all of this.
We believe she's planned this murder meticulously, so she's an extreme danger to the public out there.
Police build their evidence against Yvonne Cayler, but at this stage it's purely circumstantial. So the focus turns to questioning Yvonne while in custody.
Yvonne, do you recognise the person in that CCTV?
Look, bow-legged, fat, bow-legged to me.
Even though it could be clear that the person on the CCTV is Yvonne, Yvonne is denying that that is her, and that is not enough on its own to convict somebody of murder.
It was almost like it was a joke. Like she had padded herself up with some sort of padding, and she had a high vis on, a moustache, it looks like she'd bought in a joke shop, a wig and a goatee. And it was the most surreal. I can't to this day even look at it, like, I literally can't believe the way she dressed up and how she thought she was going to get away with that, because you can clearly see that that is her.
When I heard that Yvonne had dressed up to get into the flat, I was just gobsmacked. Never have even thought of anything like that.
Well, I couldn't tell if it was fake beard.
Do you own a fake beard?
No, I don't own a fake beard.
Do you own a fake wig?
No, I don't know fake wig.
By denying her presence on the CCTV, Yvonne was trying to achieve the smoke and mirrors that she'd of her plan. She wanted the police to believe that this was a man, and in fact, in her police interview, she tells the police officer that she thought it was a man who was bow-legged. Again, this was just part of her callous plan.
I'm fat, but I'm not bow-legged. I look like a man to me. I couldn't see his face.
What do you think looked like a man?
Just what they're wearing looked like a dude.
Then there is a breakthrough in the case. Results have come back from the forensic lab, which had been analysing the blood found on the broken chicken pot.
The breaking of the casserole pot at the moment that it was used to strike her had quite clearly cut the hands of the person who was holding it at the time, because on some of those ceramic pieces were found blood, the DNA of which did not match Nikki Collingbourne, but which did match that of Yvonne Cayler.
I knew in my mind Yvonne has murdered Nikki. I just knew.
Yvonne Cayler was quickly charged with murder.
Well, of course
Why
they
would
knew.
you think that's me?
Because to me, it looks like the person's wearing a wig and a beard.
Well, I don't know about a wig, but they look like they had a beard.
We suspect that person
His
has
name.
murdered your sister.
Well, it ain't me, because I ain't going to be able to push on that door like that.
Yeah, you said, we believe it's you. You said it's not you.
I know, you can't believe you think it's me.
Having been charged with the murder of Nikki Collingbourne, Yvonne Cayler maintains her innocence, but is remanded in custody until a trial date is set. Nikki's body is released, so she can finally be laid to rest.
Nikki was loved by so many people. At a funeral, there were so many people there that obviously I knew, and so many people had travelled from all over to come to her funeral. They'd all bought pictures of her, like at the nursery with the kids, and they all put it on a big board, and it was lovely.
But the funeral brings more devastating news for the family.
Nikki's mum, Rena, it destroyed her. She was like, she died, they did like a day before the funeral. She didn't even get to bury her daughter.
With overwhelming evidence stacking against her, Yvonne Kaler has been charged with the murder of Nikki Collingbourne. Having pleaded not guilty, Kaler's trial begins at Luton Crown Court.
The main issue in the case was the identity of the person who had been captured on the CCTV forcing their way in, because Yvonne Kaler's defence to the charge of murder was a perfectly simple one. It wasn't me and I was elsewhere at the time.
As the case opens, Nikki's family take to the stand.
I think I was one of the first people to give evidence, so I couldn't actually go and sit in the gallery until I'd given my evidence. I just remember when I did go in, that obviously the very first person I did see was Yvonne. She was just smirking, trying to make me feel uncomfortable.
And they reveal a major fallout between Nikki and her half-sister Yvonne when the latter came to the UK to visit family for a few months.
Yvonne had been at Nikki's for a few months. They'd had a few bad days, a couple of little rows, and either Yvonne or Nikki would end up in my mum's house, which is where we resided at the time. And, you know, we could kind of see the tension, you know, getting a bit more.
So I think they lived together for a very short length of time, like 5 months. But in that 5 months, a lot happened. Like, a lot happened. Yvonne was literally trying to manipulate Nikki into doing everything for her. It was like she was using Nikki, basically. She was just using her.
So when Nikki told us that she was going to evict Yvonne, we were ecstatic, really, because Nikki had been in a bit of a state for a couple of weeks, maybe a little bit longer.
Tension arose between them whilst they were living in the flat, and Nikki Collingbourne asked her to leave. On the day of her departure, there was unpleasantness between them, and Yvonne Kaler made a complaint to the police that Nikki Collingbourne had assaulted her. And the police came to the flat and they arrested Nikki Collingbourne, and she was taken to a local police station. Having interviewed her, it wasn't long before I think they realised that there wasn't any substance to the complaint, and she was released from custody, allowed to go home, and in fact nothing further was ever done in respect of that complaint.
But whilst Nikki was busy explaining herself to local police, it seems Yvonne was taking her revenge for being evicted.
While Nikki was being questioned, Yvonne paid a locksmith to break in, basically. She proved that she'd lived there because obviously she had paperwork to say that that was her address, but obviously she wasn't on the tenancy. And so the locksmith, like, he had no idea, because she was very manipulative. She just pulls the wool out over everyone's eyes.
Whilst Nikki was in custody with the police, Yvonne stole loads of stuff.
Once inside Nikki's flat, it seemed Yvonne stole some of her half-sister's belongings, something Nikki discovered when she arrived home.
Well, she immediately reported what had taken place to the police, that her sister had let herself in to what was Nikki's home without permission, and Yvonne Kaler was arrested as a result of that complaint.
But Yvonne seemed determined to wheedle her way out of trouble.
Yvonne Kaler was now in big trouble. She was facing a burglary charge and a trial at a Crown Court. She approached Nikki's ill, elderly mother in an attempt to persuade her to say that the property that she'd taken belonged to her.
She was subsequently charged with offences of burglary and doing acts tending and intended to pervert the course of justice, and those proceedings, that case was due to be tried at the Crown Court at Cambridge.
While awaiting her day in court for burglary, Yvonne was released on bail on the condition she didn't contact Nikki.
She breached those conditions. She would phone her up, try and make contact with her, and did so in such a way as to cause considerable alarm to Nikki.
Nikki was certainly living in fear of Yvonne due to the burglary and perverting the course of justice.
I think she was just hoping that Yvonne would get on a plane and go back to America and just leave her in peace, because wherever she went, she was always looking over her shoulder, and yeah, it wasn't very nice for her to see her like that. She'd gone completely within herself. She's not bubbly anymore.
Yvonne's trial for burglary and perverting the course of justice was listed for May 23rd. Her half-sister Nikki was due to give evidence against her, something which police believe made Yvonne carry out her deadly plan.
Yvonne Cayler is a very controlling and manipulative person. She likes to be in control. However, once she's charged with burglary and perverting the course of justice, the court process is out of her control. So to try and wrestle that control back, she's been very, very callous in planning and executing the murder of her stepsister.
The court hears how on the day she was due to stand trial for burglary, Yvonne donned her disguise and entered the flat where Nikki lived, approaching her door.
Then this shocking scene of the door being opened, and what we surmised from the way that she was dressed and the towel and the half-full bath is that Nikki had been in the bathroom with a towel wrapped round her, with just her underwear on. She was preparing to have a morning bath. She heard the doorbell go. She opened the door, and as she recognised it was her sister, she would have been really frightened and shocked at the realisation of seeing that, although it was her sister was disguised in this bizarre way, and I think she would immediately have known that she was in really serious danger. And there was a struggle at the door. And as you watched it, there were that awful couple of seconds where it looked as though she was just about to get the door shut, before finally it was forced open and Yvonne Cayler went in, and then the door shut behind her. And then 2 hours of nothing.
Once inside the flat, the prosecution claims Yvonne and Nikki argued in the kitchen, and as Nikki turned to walk away, Yvonne attacked her.
The chicken dish would have been picked up by two hands and used with considerable force, and Nikki would have been walking away from that. Certainly was enough to render her unconscious.
Then Yvonne panicked and tried to stage the scene.
There's been an attempt made to make this look like a suicide. So there was injuries to Nikki's wrists to make it look like she'd self-harmed. There was also a big tidy-up of the flat, and including the staging of placing a dustpan brush in Nikki's left hand.
Having tried to make it look as though Nikki had cut herself on the broken pot and bled to death while trying to clear it up, Yvonne is once again caught on CCTV leaving the flat.
She was carrying some plastic bags that she hadn't had with her when she arrived, so she clearly had some property in the bags. One of the things which we consider she did when she left and which was in the bag were some of the remnants from the casserole pot that had been used, because one of the things the police did was they put it all back together again. It was like a 3D jigsaw. But what it demonstrated once they'd done it was that there were a number of the pieces missing. We surmised that she'd realised that there was her blood on the broken pieces, and she had taken those which she could find with bloodstains on them in the plastic carrier bag. But unfortunately for her, unfortunately for us, she left a couple behind.
When Yvonne Cayler was shown the CCTV footage, her reaction was one of denial.
Yvonne, do you recognise the person in that CCTV?
Look, bow-legged, fat, bow-legged to me. I'm fat, but I'm not bow-legged. It looked like a man to me. I couldn't see his face.
As the trial progresses, Yvonne continues to deny her involvement. Then the prosecution calls a new witness.
Actually, the worst moment thinking about it through the trial was when they brought prisoner to give evidence against Yvonne.
We found out that there was a prisoner that Yvonne had spent some time with while she was on remand. She was going to be released quite soon.
She decided to draw a map of my flat and try and bribe a prisoner that was being released to set fire to my flat, knowing that my daughter was living here at the time with my 2 grandchildren.
She had this idea that if she gave her some of her DNA, I think it was blood, on a cotton bud or something, that she could leave the evidence there and set fire to it and say, well, someone's trying to frame me, because how would my blood be at a scene when I'm in prison? So someone's obviously framed me for the murder of Nikki.
But Yvonne's bizarre plan to try to suggest she had been set up for the murder didn't sway the jury. With all the facts presented to them, including the CCTV footage and the DNA evidence, the jury retires to consider its verdict.
So at one point in the trial, I honestly thought it was going to go the other way. It was like almost like her defence was like making it kind of out like she couldn't have possibly done this, and like honestly, we honestly thought at one point maybe she's going to get away with this. Honestly, it's a really scary feeling. Even though we knew all the evidence was there, it's convincing that jury that she did that.
On December the 19th, 2016, Yvonne Cayler is found guilty of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 20 years.
Yvonne Cayler could have accepted the burglary charges or gone to trial on the burglary charges and let the jury decide. But she decided not to. She hatched a plan, cold, calculated, and she killed Nikki Collingbourne rather than face a trial for burglary.
When the guilty verdict was read out, I think there was the biggest sigh of relief to know that she was going to be locked up and that we would just never have to have anything to do with her ever again, and that we could then tell our children that this bad person is now in prison and she can't touch any of us anymore.
After Nikki passed away, people would like come up to me and say how sorry they were, and they'd always have a memory of her helping them in some way. Like, she would literally go out of her way to help people. She loved to make people happy, and that's what Nikki lived for, because seeing other people happy made her happy. Like, I can't explain. She was just such a gentle soul.
Experience the power of science to crack a crime. Forensics Catching the Killer is new Friday at 9 on Sky Mix.
Two brutal killings, a massive manhunt, and it shocked the whole town.
The officers went to the 7th floor flat, saw this man holding a sawn-off shotgun. He went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. The press in London called him Spider-Man.
On the night of January the 23rd, 1995, Lancashire police were called to a garage in Morecambe. What they discovered there could have been the scene from a horror film. The investigation into what turned out to be a brutal double murder and the ensuing manhunt for the killer would take the police all over the country. It was a case that the police and the people of Morecambe would never, ever forget. In January 1995, Morecambe, a picturesque seaside town in Lancashire, was about to become front-page news when the dead body of a man was found. DCI Graham Gooch from Lancashire Constabulary was to lead what would become an unprecedented investigation.
On the night in question, I was the duty on-call senior investigating officer, but sound asleep in bed, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone went, which means something awful's happened somewhere. So I took the call and they said they'd had a murder at Morecambe.
The officers had been faced with a gruesome scene at a garage on the Whiteland industrial estate. The dead body had been severely battered.
They tell you basically what's happened, and then you start thinking, what am I going to need? Where shall I rendezvous with the officers on the scene? And start the process rolling.
DCI Colin Mooney was appointed as Deputy Senior Investigating Officer on the case, an unusual one for this normally quiet holiday resort.
Morecambe's quite a low crime area to live in, particularly compared with other areas of Lancashire. It's got a great beach, and it's got the estuary. There's a famous walk across the Morecambe Bay, a guided walk.
It's not the big razzmatazz of Blackpool, no big rides and things like that, but it has its own lovely appeal. The Queen Mother once came to Morecambe and described Morecambe's view as a $65,000 view.
I would say Morecambe's probably one of the very safest places to live. It's sort of like a bit of a sleepy town. There's not really that much horrendous trouble, you know.
The wives of 49-year-old Tony Morocco and 29-year-old Paul Sandham had phoned the police, worried about their husbands who had worked at the garage together and not returned home.
They were creatures of habit. They'd finish their work about 5 o'clock and go home. And this night, they hadn't. The officers went to the garage with the relatives, and it was locked. And then they found somebody who's got a key to come along and unlock it. So the premises were locked. And inside, then they'd found this scene of destruction. Clearly, it looked as though someone had been playing dodgems with the cars, and there was smashed office furniture, smashed cabinets. And on the floor was the body of Tony Morocco.
Tony's body, unfortunately, bore considerable marks of violence. It looked as though he'd been stabbed and that his head had suffered a number of blows from a blunt instrument.
Well, certainly the amount of violence used was far in excess of that was needed to actually bring about death. There was something very emphatic about it, almost as if the person was acting out, I know, some sense of mission or getting revenge.
From his injuries, it was immediately clear to police that Tony Morocco had been brutally murdered on the premises of his own business. After pathologists had analysed the scene, his body was carefully removed, and along with crime scene investigators, DCI Gooch tried to figure out what had happened.
Left at the scene, there was a lot of blood there. There was a torque wrench, which had blood and traces of body on it and hair, so that appeared to be a fairly obvious murder weapon. And lots of other pieces, because garages are generally fairly messy places, so there's a lot of stuff to look at. But then here we had the feature of this car, this Toyota car, which had obviously crashed into the desk and into the cupboards. So clearly that was part of whatever had happened at the scene. So we knew that we had to do a lot more investigation into that. But of course the first thing on your mind is, who did this?
The police didn't have to look far for their first suspect.
The situation we had was these two men who worked together in the garage. They hadn't come home. We've been along there and we found the body of one of them and the other man's missing. It's not unreasonable to have some suspicion that they'd fallen out, had a terrible argument, and that this was the result of it. Because, I mean, Paul Sandham was nowhere to be found. He hadn't gone home, which was most unusual.
The police immediately focused on locating Paul Sandham.
Officers have been called out to come to Morecambe to start forming an investigation team. In the morning, those officers had turned up about 8, 9 o'clock, and we'd started the briefing, painting the scene for them to tell them what was going on, what we were going to do, and what each of them would be doing. And then, during that briefing, in came one of the officers saying, "Hang on, boss, I think there's been a development," and hands me a piece of paper saying the body's been found further, just out in the countryside, a little way from Morecambe. And then we found out that that was Paul Sandham, who had been stabbed many, many times.
The man police had been treating as a suspect had been left for dead with 41 knife wounds.
There was a clear connection between the two victims, and also the level of violence used on both of them was quite similar. It did bring into focus the fact that there had been a deliberate separation of the two victims, which of course highlighted just how calculated it was.
At this point, then, we realised that we had a double murder on our hands. It was inconceivable that two people who worked so closely together, who went missing at about the same time, and both found murdered, would not be linked.
I've dealt with murders before with more than one victim. They don't come very often, but it does change things completely from what we were looking at before. Before, we were looking for possibly a murder with a reasonable suspect. Now suddenly you've got a double murder with no suspect. And it was a great concern to local people.
I spent most of my working life on the estate from being the age of 13. You know, I got to know Tony, you know, just through, you know, being on the estate like I got to know everybody else. He was a lovely guy. If anybody was going to say, you know, put Tony in a room of 10 other people, you know, who would get murdered, you know, you wouldn't put Tony, you'd say, well, what's he doing here? It was that shocking that, you know, it was just beyond belief, really.
The local press, the local radio, everybody was covering this big story, which was very helpful because it was a big story.
We've got here 2 brutal killings, a massive manhunt, something the like of which Morecambe had never seen before. And we were in the centre of it, being the town's newspaper, and we were swept up by it, and without a doubt we realised the enormity of the story and that we had to rise to this challenge.
Lancashire police had 2 dead bodies on their hands and no idea who could have committed the murders. The most dramatic investigation they had ever been faced with was about to commence. Police in Morecambe were dealing with a brutal double murder and no suspect. The body of Tony Morocco had been found at his garage business, and his co-worker Paul Sandham was found a mile down the road in a field. He'd been stabbed 41 times.
When people learned of what had happened to Tony and Paul, it was just pure shock. Or anybody on the estate could quite believe what had happened. It was unreal, just unreal.
Tony Morocco was very well known. He had a wide circle of friends and a big customer base. His partner Paul probably was lesser well known, but he'd obviously known to all the customers.
Sad thing for Paul. Paul had just recovered from cancer. You know, gone through a grueling time with that. You know, to have his life pulled away from him in one flash of it, you know, it was absolutely shocking.
After speaking to friends and family, police started investigating Tony's business, hoping to find a clue that would lead them to the murderer.
The kind of work that Tony was involved in, the purchase and sale of low-value vehicles, indicated to us that it was largely a cash business, but there was no cash found on the body. So we did some checks, and we were right that there should have been some cash there. It looked like a robbery might have been the motive. In addition to that, Mrs. Morocco was able to tell us that Tony had a heavy gold chain around his neck, which he never took off, I think for sentimental reasons, except for just one occasion when he'd broken a link and it was repaired by a local jeweller. And that was missing as well.
Armed with their evidence, police began building a picture of what could have happened on that fateful night.
It became apparent to us that Paul Sandham had been taken away and murdered first. We guessed that this Toyota car had been used to take him away, presumably on a test drive. And he killed him in the field and then come back in the Toyota and crashed it into the garage when he arrived. We tend to assume that he'd gone along there, found two members of staff there which he thought he couldn't overcome them. So on the pretext of wanting to buy a car, had got Paul Sandham away and killed him so he could go back and rob Tony.
Regardless of their theory, police still needed concrete evidence that the murders were linked and the Toyota car was significant.
It's very important to isolate the two scenes to make sure there's no contamination, because we wanted to find out if that car had been in the field. So we found next to the road, we got a tyre track, which eventually found matched the Toyota, but also, more importantly, we found soil of identical makeup in the footwell of the car as was in the entrance to the field. Now, the important thing was this was found on the driver's side and not the passenger side. So it showed only one person who had been out of the car got back into it, and that was the driver. And that had gone back to TM Motors.
For me, more significantly, there was a trainer mark in mud in the field close to Paul Sandham's body. And there was also a similar trainer mark in blood in T&M Motors. So it was clear to us that the murders were linked, and the Fila trainer mark was a definite scientific link between those two murders.
With the crashed Toyota car left at the garage, police needed to establish how the killer had travelled around.
One of the lines of inquiry which we had was to try to establish whether or not there was a getaway vehicle involved and whether or not anybody had seen it. The only thing that we could find out was that somebody dimly recalled seeing a pedal cycle propped up against the wall outside T&M Motors. And to be honest, I don't think that the police put a great deal of store by that at the time, because who goes to commit a murder on a pedal cycle?
One of the members of staff of the garage who worked there part-time came in to help us, and he checked to see that all the cars were there, and he found there was one missing. And this was a white MG Metro, which was probably the best of the bunch of cars that were in the garage, and that one was missing. Not only was the car missing, but also the paperwork, the logbook and the receipts and that for the vehicle. So clearly the murderer had not only just taken the car as a getaway, he'd also made sure he got all the documents for it. So clearly he probably intended to move the car on later, and that was important to us. I mean, it tells you a lot about the person you're looking for, that this isn't somebody who's just done something on the spur of the moment. The fact that he's lured one man away to kill him just so he can go back and do a petty robbery shows this is a dangerous and determined person.
DCI Gooch had another suspicion about the murderer's connection to the crime scene.
Did he know the garage? Had he been there before? You take the idea, he wouldn't have come from a million miles away. It's fairly tucked away on the White Lund estate. It's something somebody local would have known, or somebody who knew the area very well. He wouldn't have just turned up there from a long way away and gone there on spec.
With the white Metro missing, they now had a vehicle to look out for. The car was placed on the police national computer as a vehicle of interest and also flagged with other relevant organisations.
There is an organisation which members of the public and car dealers can use to check whether or not a vehicle is stolen. We contacted that organisation and asked that if anybody checks that vehicle with them, that they should tell us, but not tell them.
So, having put a marker for the MG Metro onto HPI, only a couple of days later, they called us to say that someone had gone into a garage in Erith in southeast London to sell the car.
The hire purchase information alert was an important breakthrough, but this meant geographically the investigation had to expand 275 miles down south.
Very quickly, we sent a team down to London to check this out, and the man in the garage did a few second-hand cars. He did repairs and lower end of the market sort of cars, and he remembered the man who had taken in because he'd done a few deals with him before, and he checked it and there was nothing outstanding on HPI at that time. So a deal was done and he part exchanged it for a Ford Escort.
The Erith car dealer provided an accurate description of the man that had sold him the white Metro, but wasn't much more help to the police as the suspect had covered his tracks.
He'd given false particulars, which gave us something to look at, but essentially it looked like a bit of a dead end. We didn't have any more information to go on then.
Unfortunately, and perhaps alarmingly, the car dealer had traded on the MG Metro, but luckily for us, he knew where it was, and we were able to catch up with the vehicle pretty soon thereafter. And so we seized it, we brought it back to Lancashire and had it examined by our scientific officers. They found traces of blood on the driver's door handle, and it would have been reasonable to expect that it was either Mr. Morocco or Mr. Sandham's, but it wasn't. This was the blood of a third person. And we began to speculate that perhaps in the frenzied attack on the two deceased's, maybe, just maybe, the murderer had cut himself, and that this was, in fact, the murderer's blood.
It was looking like a DNA breakthrough. All police needed was a match.
Another important element that came in then was the car that he'd bought from the dealer in Erith, because we had the registration number for that. And then we found, by putting that on the police national computer, we found the car had been stopped in the City of London. Now, what was happening at that time, there was anti-terrorist procedures. Now, the officer who stopped him couldn't actually remember it, but we knew it was near one of the CCTVs that was part of what they call the Ring of Steel around the City of London at the time. Now, when we got that film back, there was the car with a man driving it. Now, the pictures were a bit fuzzy, not good enough to identify, but we noticed that the hand on the steering wheel appeared to be bandaged.
Using the description supplied by the Erith car dealer, the police released a sketch of the suspect to the national press, hoping it might trigger more leads.
After we'd released the artist impression, I got a phone call in the major incident room from a detective from the Kent Constabulary. And he told me quite definitively, "Here, Gov, I think I know who did your murders." And the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This sounded like a breakthrough.
There appeared to be a link with a man who'd been robbing jewellery shops in Kent.
There was some CCTV footage of one of the robberies where the offender was particularly and gratuitously violent towards the shop assistant, punching her in the face when there's absolutely no need to do that. DC Cullen was one of the officers involved in that investigation. He told me that he thought the person responsible for our murders was a man by the name of Terence Derrick Clifton.
Clifton was a suspect in the robberies, and having seen the artist's impression of the man Lancashire police were trying to track down, DC Cullen had thought the resemblance uncanny.
We did some quick checks on the name and the date of birth provided to us by Dick Cullen, and I was delighted to find that Clifton had a conviction in Lancashire, but not just Lancashire, Morecambe. This clearly made a connection between a man who lived in the South East London area and sleepy old Morecambe in Lancashire.
I think when the link was made with the earlier crimes, the robberies of the jewellers, for example, it became apparent that this was an individual who was on the fringes of society, who seemed to see himself as outside the law. Somebody who's very much playing by his own rules, maybe with his own sense of purpose.
Armed with their new evidence, the police moved quickly. The hunt was on for Terry Clifton. In their search for a double killer, Lancashire police had identified a prime suspect. All they needed to do now is find him. Intelligence pointed to a man called Terence Clifton for the murders of Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham. But they were yet to track Clifton down and still needed evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime.
Now, one of the important things is on Tony Morocco's body, there was an awful lot of blood. And when they looked at his trousers, they'd taken blood samples from about 6 sites, which is the normal thing to do, and they'd all been the same blood group and they'd all been Tony's blood. However, they went back to it then and looked inside the pocket where his money would have been. And inside the pocket, another blood sample was taken, and that turned out that that wasn't Tony's. So suddenly, here we had the blood sample from the murderer, we thought. So now the case is really building up. We've got this suggested name from the intelligence officer in Kent. We've got a description that would appear to be matched. And now we've got blood from the murderer in the pocket of the deceased. So now we've got to match it.
Clifton had been in prison before, but this was 1995, when personal profile details held on convicts were limited.
Nowadays, it's quite routine for people coming into custody to have a mouth swab taken with a view to having their DNA recorded on the National DNA Database. But that wasn't the case way back then. So what we needed was a sample of Clifton's blood to compare with the blood of the third person from the crime scenes and from the MG Metro.
The investigation was now a nationwide search, and Lancashire police gathered as much support as they could without naming their suspect.
We always enjoyed a pretty good relationship with the police, and on this particular incident, it was outstanding, because partly the police needed us as well to help catch the guy.
We decided to release the artist's impressions to the local paper, and that brought about another development. A young lady came to the police station and she said that based on the artist's impression, she thought that the person that we were looking for was none other than Terence Clifton. She explained that Terence had attended school in the area, and significantly that he had been in the Morecambe area around the Christmas and New Year period of 1995. The witness went on to say that that Clifton had arrived in the area in a big old BMW car that he'd driven up from London, but that he had sold it and bought another car locally. And it came as no surprise that transaction took place at T&M Motors. In fact, the BMW was still lying in the yard at T&M when we went to check.
He'd gone to trade this old car in, and he wasn't happy that Tony had only given him a couple £100 for it or something like that. And then he wanted money because there was petrol in the tank. And Tony took out his big wad of money and peeled off a £5 and said, "Yeah, there's £5 for the petrol." And he very much resented that.
The police now had an additional motive for the murders: revenge.
So the woman who went into Morecambe Police Station to say she'd seen Clifton and knew him was able to tell us that he'd stayed with a family in Morecambe the night before the murders. And when we saw them, they were able to tell us, yes, he'd stayed there the night before.
The people that Clifton had been staying with were also able to say that one day he came out onto the street where his car was parked to find that the tyres had been slashed, and he was extremely annoyed. He turned to his schoolmate, the person he'd been stopping with, and asked to borrow his pedal cycle, saying that he was going to go down to the Whiteland estate where he knew a couple of blokes who were going to sort him out a motor. This, of course, explained why no car was seen at T&M Motors and explained the presence of a pedal cycle propped up against the door at the relevant time. A little while later, Clifton appeared back at the family home. Then he was driving a white hatchback car, and the pedal cycle belonging to the young man with whom he'd been staying was sticking out the back. So he returned the pedal cycle and set off, saying that he was bound back for London.
Police confiscated the bike for forensic testing, where blood was found that matched that on the white Metro and in Tony Morocco's pocket. But they couldn't connect this blood to their suspect.
So we're obviously waiting for a DNA match to see whether or not we could definitively tie that blood to Terence Derek Clifton, but at that stage we didn't have it.
The police could only get the blood test they needed if they were able to arrest Clifton.
We'd already had officers down in London after the initial call, but now we sent more of a team down there to try to find him. And it was becoming very difficult. He certainly didn't make it easy for us. He was changing cars almost daily. And then he was moving from place to place where he was staying, and we always seemed to be a bit behind him.
I get a sense of a continuing theme of him versus the world. Him seeing himself as this character, almost a heroic character who can rise above adversity and demonstrate, in some respects, a superiority. He can give the police the runaround and get away with pretty much what he chooses.
When it was a bit of a manhunt to London, well then you think, Jesus, help me catch him. Everybody was sort of like shocked and look, you know, it was very hard for everybody. I mean, you know, it's all right for me to sit here saying it was hard. Imagine what his family felt like.
At this point, Lancashire Constabulary had officers at a police station in Bexley Heath in Kent, and they also had backup from the Metropolitan Police.
The murder investigation was turning into a manhunt. He was always giving an alias, but there's a common theme to those aliases.
Whilst he was going around giving people false names and addresses to people who didn't know him, there were clues in it for us, because a lot of the names he was given were sort of mix and match of places he'd lived before and people who he'd known or relatives. At one of the addresses at which he'd stayed, we found a gold Belcher chain which he'd swapped for some cannabis. And we were able to take that to a jeweller in Lancaster who had repaired it, and he was able to identify it as being the chain he'd repaired for Tony Morocco.
Then the manhunt suddenly turned a corner, when on the 27th of February 1995, 1 month into the investigation, police pursued a lead in Erith in Kent.
Well, the officers went to the 7th floor flat of one of Clifton's ex-girlfriends, because we had reason to suspect he was there. So as they were going through the front door, the officer who was down on the ground saw Clifton backing out of the flat and holding a sawn-off shotgun, pointing in towards the flat. So we've now gone up a stage because he's armed and we know he's dangerous. But then he put the gun down and went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. He just let go on each floor and dropped, and then just grabbed the railing of the flat below to slow himself down. And he did that all the way down to the ground, and then he ran off. After that, the press in London called him Spider-Man, and that was it.
I think part of my feelings at the time was I wish she'd fell off that tower block halfway down. You know, the man was a psychopath.
The police recovered the discarded shotgun, but now knew Clifton had access to firearms. He was now a huge danger to the public, and he was on the run.
Then we took the unusual step of publicising his name. Normally you don't publish the names of suspects until somebody's charged. But with this man on the loose and being so dangerous, we had to do that in the hope that people would come forward and tell us where he is, because nobody wants him on the loose in their community, because if he can do this sort of thing, he might do the same to them.
It was unnerving because the sheer brutality of it kept people on edge. They'd never known anything like it before. Somebody capable of doing that was capable of doing anything.
Two grieving families, a community on guard, and an armed killer. It was more urgent than ever. The police were closing in on Terence Clifton, who they believed had killed Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham in cold blood.
The London team had been chasing down the long chain of cars that Clifton had been buying and selling on. And they were hot on the trail of one particular car when they identified it parked up in a street. So the Metropolitan Police firearms team and Lancashire officers kept a watch on the car. And a man came to the car and got in. He was immediately surrounded by the armed officers and was arrested at gunpoint. Unfortunately, it wasn't Clifton. It was, however, a man who'd bought the car from Clifton only a number of hours previously. And once he'd been dusted down, he was able to tell us that, and to tell us the car that Clifton had bought off him. We were now only hours behind our suspect.
Clifton was reported to be driving an Austin Montego.
Now, in possession of information that he was in the Montego motor car, there were a number of officers plotted up in the area, and then two officers saw him get into the car, and then he went round and parked up in Finstead Road. It was called in, and the armed team then went in, and he was arrested. He surrendered straight away.
Finally, they'd got Clifton. Arrested at gunpoint on the 6th of March 1995, 6 weeks after the murders.
We had him now. And so it's a great relief that this man's no longer on the streets. He's a very dangerous man, and he's now locked up. So that was a huge relief. But then you see the job from my end of things particularly is really just starting, because now you've got to put all that evidence together to turn it into a case of admissible evidence.
When news of the arrest came through, it came as a relief to us, and I think also to our readers and obviously the families, that we were able to print the fact that finally this person the police had been looking for so long and who had been involved in so many escape dramas had finally been arrested, and that we were getting somewhere.
Police needed to prove that blood found on the stolen white Metro, the pushbike connected to the crime, and in Tony Morocco's pocket, belonged to Clifton. They took DNA swabs from him and awaited the results.
Yes, having been arrested down in London, then obviously he had to be brought up to Lancaster, where he was held. And we questioned him, and he thought he could be cleverer than us, if you like, because he was told briefly what the evidence was. And he said he happened to be walking through the White Lund Industrial Estate, like you do, and he'd seen this car parked at the roadside, the white Metro, with the keys in it and all the documents lying on the seat. And he just intended to steal the car. And that was his defence.
He was rational, he was polite, he admitted the theft of the MG Metro, but claimed that he had nothing to do whatsoever with the murders. So, following the interviews, we decided that we were going to charge him, notwithstanding the fact that we didn't have the DNA evidence at that stage. We did feel that we had sufficient evidence to charge, and we did.
Clifton was remanded in custody while he awaited trial, and several weeks later the results of his DNA swab came through, which, as police suspected, was a match with DNA evidence from the double murder.
We had this man with a history of extreme violence. We had a man who knew the area, despite the fact he had a London address. He'd been to school in Morecambe. He was known to be in the area. He'd borrowed a bicycle to go to the garage and had come back later with the white Metro, with the bicycle in it, with blood on it, which was his blood. Then we had his blood in Tony Morocco's pocket at the scene. We then had footprints at the scene of that murder and at the scene of Paul Sandham's murder. We could link the two scenes again because of the earth from the field and the earth in the driver's footwell of the Toyota that Clifton had then driven back to the garage. We've got the Belcher chain that was found in London that he'd swapped for some cannabis, which we could then identify positively as being Tony Morocco's. So we got an awful lot of evidence to make a case for the prosecution.
So in the next few months, Clifton made a number of appearances, both at the Crown Court and at the Magistrates' Court, as part of the process leading towards his eventual trial. His behaviour had deteriorated from that at the time of his interview. He assaulted a prison officer on one occasion and blew raspberries at the judge on another occasion.
On Saturday, the 24th of June 1995, Clifton was due to be formally committed for trial at Lancashire Magistrates' Court.
And then we came to the worst of all in his behaviour. He said he wanted private consultation with his solicitor, which he is entitled. So was taken into a room with his solicitor. Then he produced a sharpened telescopic car aerial, which he'd secreted within his rectum before he left prison, and then held this against his solicitor's throat and threatened him and took him hostage.
We called in a hostage negotiator, and we also called in officers who were trained to put an end to a siege like this by more forceful means.
I remember getting a call from a colleague at quite an early hour of the morning to say that there was an incident in progress at Lancaster Magistrates' Court. At that time, I worked for the prison service, and I was on call for hostage negotiation situations.
Dr. Need made his way to the court, while Lancashire police tried to manage the situation as best they could.
As part of this siege, he called for an imam to come and speak to him, claiming that he was a convert to Islam, and the imam duly came and spoke to him and declared that, in his opinion, he wasn't a convert.
When I arrived, everybody was rather tired, but above all, I think, attention focused on the well-being of the hostage.
The siege itself, from the time we took him, lasted for some 21 hours. So it's gone on a long time. And of course, when you're dealing with somebody like that, who's not that well balanced and clearly dangerous, as time goes on, they're getting tired, and either they give up or they can get worse and worse. At the end, things were getting worse, and that's why there had to be a rapid intervention.
It was decided that we should explore the possibility of tactical intervention, and that really centred upon separating Clifton from the hostage. And that was achieved by offering Clifton a cup of coffee, which he accepted, took a few steps over to reach for it, and at that point the door to the room burst open and several gentlemen jumped on him. So it was brought to a peaceful resolution.
It was erratic behaviour, and it may have been just part of the delaying tactics. I'm not sure what he felt that he had to gain by taking his solicitor hostage. It seemed to me to be the last turn of the card of an increasingly desperate man.
Clifton's troublemaking continued. He sacked his defence lawyer and told police he would represent himself. The trial at Preston Crown Court didn't happen for 2 years.
So eventually he came up for trial in January of 1997. And then when it came to the day of trial, he refused to come out of the cell and face his own trial.
Because Clifton was unrepresented, it meant that the witnesses were not cross-examined, although the judge maintained the impartiality of the trial by asking pertinent questions of the witnesses himself. But nonetheless, the pace of the trial was much quicker than you would normally expect, and I recall that on one occasion, in excess of 30 witnesses in one day were heard.
At the trial, the injuries sustained by Tony Morocco were so bad, it took the pathologist like 45 minutes just to describe the injuries, and the family sat through all that.
The jury didn't take a long time at all to convict him of the murders. In a matter of 40 minutes or so, they'd returned unanimous verdicts of guilty to 2 offences of murder and 1 of the theft of the white MG car.
All that was left was to sentence Clifton for his horrific crimes.
The judge insisted, quite rightly, he'd be brought up for sentencing, and he wasn't for going quietly. And it took 9 prison officers a long time, having to have him wrap him in sheets to stop him kicking and punching and biting the officers, and they carried him up to the dock where he heard the sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment twice over for each of the murders and 4 years for stealing the car. The family who'd sat throughout the trial listened to the dreadful things that happened to their relatives, and I think they were very relieved at the outcome of the trial and the fact that he was going away, hopefully forever.
It was the most shocking and demanding investigation Lancashire police had ever seen, but finally it had come to an end.
The chain of events, working backwards from the siege to the escape from the balcony, the fact that it was a double murder, the fact that it was a manhunt, I just don't think that anybody could have written a credible script that could have fitted our scenario.
We knew we weren't far away, and we knew if we kept going, then eventually we'd get him, and we did.
After 3 months playing cat and mouse with the police, a sensational escape and a hostage situation, Terry Clifton would be an old man if and when he was ever released. And finally, the town of Morecambe could start trying to get back to normal.
With 5-star reviews across the board and immense performances from Jodie Foster and Kaylee Reese, True Detective Night Country is available now on Sky Atlantic.
Police have launched a murder inquiry after an elderly woman was found dead at her home in Fleckney.
I was gobsmacked. There's something could happen like this, literally on my doorstep.
This case was one of a kind. Not only the nature of it, but the brutal nature of it.
When I found out, it just floored me. How? Why could that happen?
This is an old lady who's been murdered and seriously sexually assaulted in her home.
How could somebody that I'd grown up with be capable of doing something like that?
A lot of people were generally scared.
This just doesn't look right.
There was no sign of forced entry, so it was obvious that it was somebody that she knew.
Open the door!
Right, at this moment in time, I'm arrested on suspicion of murder.
7 miles south of Leicester, in the heart of the English countryside, lies the quaint village of Fleckney.
Fleckney is a quiet village. It's very close-knit. It's like it has its own little bubble. People are very very close. Everybody knows everybody. Most people are related in Fleckney.
Beautiful rural settings, friendly people, local community is fantastic. But yeah, lovely, lovely place to live and grow up in.
It's not the sort of place where a lot of crime happens. I'd been to Fleckney a few times that had nothing to do with crime. I'd been there to judge a talent contest. I think it was called Fleckney's Got Talent.
The people who live in Fleckney are generally well-to-do. It's quite a low-crime area. There are retiring people there. There's some retirement bungalows around there. There's not a lot of throughfare. The people who are in Fleckney are generally the people who live there rather than the people who visit there.
And it was this perfect, idyllic village that 72-year-old Jane Hings chose to retire to.
Jane was an only child, and her mum and dad sadly passed away years before, which left her on her own with no immediate family around. Jane was quite a private person. She didn't like everyone to know, her business, and kept herself to herself, really. But once you got to know her, she opened up more, and it was just fun. She had quirky ways about her, but she was kind and she was caring.
Everybody in Fleckney knew Jane. She relied on people to give her a lift to the hairdressers, to the shops, things like that. She was inoffensive in every way. People didn't have bad things to say about her. And in her life beforehand, she worked hard.
Jane took pride in her appearance. She'd always, regular having her hair done every few weeks, and she'd always sort of make sure she was nicely dressed and put on a bit of makeup, so she'd still try and make the effort to look nice.
Having worked overseas as a nanny, Jane had settled into retirement, whilst also taking care of her much-loved rescue dog, Paddy.
He was spoilt rotten. Everything she did was for Paddy. You'd go in, there'd be dog treats stacked up to the ceiling. We'd lie on a bed at night and could look with her.
Whilst Jane used friends and neighbours to help walk Paddy, in the summer of 2017, an accident meant she needed a lot more care.
Goodbye. Jane had a fall and was admitted to hospital for about 3 or 4 weeks.
She'd suffered some injuries when her dog Paddy had pulled her over, and then when she came out of hospital, that's when she needed the carers and she needed help in getting around, and she couldn't go very far.
But the community came together for Jane, and she slowly got back on her feet.
She was the sort of person that people warmed to, they liked her, and they were happy to help out.
Then, just a few weeks after leaving hospital, tragedy strikes.
On the Sunday morning, Jane's carers went in as they were meant to, about 7 o'clock in the morning. Jane's front door was unlocked, which is normal. They went in. She was laid in bed. The cover was pulled up over her head and both of her arms were raised above her head. When they peeled back the duvet, which had covered her head entirely, they saw that she had died.
The carers are puzzled that Jane's body is covered completely by the duvet and call for an ambulance. Then, they notice something else unusual. Items are out of place in Jane's usually meticulous house.
And when the ambulance arrived, they could see that she'd been dead for some time. And the paramedic who was there, he looked around and could see that there'd been an untidy search. Some drawers were open, some things were knocked over.
Items were strewn across the floor, drawers were open.
Here is a lady who's died with the cover over her head, with the arms raised above the head, and it looks like there's been a burglary that's taken place.
With police at the scene, suspicions grow that this is not a natural death, and the house is immediately cordoned off. But with no obvious injuries, how Jane died is still a mystery, which means detectives begin to theorise what could have happened to the pensioner.
Is it a burglary that's gone wrong? Is it Jane who's suffered a heart attack following a burglary, or whether she has passed away and then a burglary has happened afterwards, or whether this is somebody who has murdered Jane and then burgled the bungalow afterwards.
The first step for detectives is to establish how Jane died.
I received a phone call from the duty detective inspector who said they had a death. They weren't 100% happy with it, and they would value my opinion on what was going on.
Dr. Hamilton attends the scene, and as well as the unusual way Jane has been tucked into her bed, his suspicions are raised further.
And the most immediately concerning thing was that her nightdress appeared to be pulled up, and that seemed very unusual for somebody who'd simply died in their sleep. This just doesn't look right, it doesn't look normal.
As suspicions are raised that she could have been the victim of a sexual attack, Jane is taken for post-mortem. But almost immediately, everything changes.
This is HFM.
Police have launched a murder inquiry after an elderly woman was found dead at her home in Fleckney. The body was discovered in a bungalow on Elizabeth Road. It's thought the victim died at some point during Saturday evening or in the early hours of Sunday.
Whilst transporting Jane, a shocking piece of evidence has been found.
As we took the body, a tongue bar fell from one of the creases in the skin. Ms. Hings didn't have a tongue piercing, so we have evidence of somebody else very close to her body. That ultimately became one of the most important pieces of evidence in catching the killer.
On a quiet Sunday morning in the village of Fleckney in Leicestershire, residents are waking up to disturbing news of a possible murder on their doorstep.
This is HFM.
Further tests are being carried out to try to determine what killed an elderly woman in her own home in Fleckney. It prompted police to launch a murder inquiry following the discovery of her body in the property on Elizabeth Road. There were signs of a disturbance in her bungalow, which has led officers to believe she may have been the victim of a burglary.
72-year-old Jane Hings has been found dead by her carers early on a Sunday morning. Her house has been burgled, and there's signs she has been sexually assaulted. Police are treating her death as suspicious and have cordoned off the scene.
There was police take from the tree round to the lamppost. You couldn't get to where, if you can just see that red car behind this thing, that was all blocked off as well, because that's the back of her house. It's not something we expected to ever happen in Fleckney. It's such a quiet village, a nice village. I was gobsmacked. There's something could happen like this, you know what I mean, on my doorstep, literally on my doorstep. And for people that I knew.
It's a place where you could leave your doors and windows open. Everybody knows everybody. But, you know, this sent shockwaves through the community. And I think that a lot of people would have felt generally scared.
With the village inundated with police vehicles, Jane's loved ones are also confronted with the news of her death.
I'd arranged to go over to Jane's on the Sunday morning to take Paddy for a walk. And as usual, I was running late. And I'd had no phone call, which was really strange. And then I pulled into the place where she lived and just saw loads of police cars, police vans, forensics, and yeah, that's when I found out. So I last spoke to Jane the night before. I was supposed to go and see her that day. I'd been on holiday, so I hadn't seen her for a couple of weeks. And we were on the phone for about an hour. I miss Jane. I miss the phone calls. There was so much she could have talked about her life, and I didn't get to hear any of it. And my phone is so deadly quiet all the time.
Whilst moving Jane's body, pathologists have discovered a tongue bar in her groin.
The investigation then shifted from, is this a burglary that's gone wrong, to this is an old lady who's been murdered and seriously sexually assaulted in her home.
That tongue bar was put into an evidence bag immediately. Everyone knew that this was potentially important. That went straight off. It was fast-tracked through the DNA lab.
As detectives wait for the DNA results, upmost on their mind is that this might not be an isolated incident.
One of our first lines of inquiry is to research cases of a similar nature, and we conducted a number of checks looking at anybody who was already convicted and in prison who could have been on day release for the same offence. But then this case was one of a kind. Not only the nature of it, but the brutal nature of it.
Immediately, door-to-door inquiries begin.
When officers initially attended the scene, they tried to identify people who would know Jane the last time that she was seen or spoken to.
Officers investigate whether Jane had any enemies in the village.
When we looked at Jane's past, there was no fallouts with anybody. There was nothing to indicate somebody with a vendetta, somebody with a grudge, any past history with anybody which would tell us this person has a long-running grudge against Jane and would want ill of her.
But locals have their own suspicions.
When the police first came, they said there was no sign of forced entry or anything like that, so it was obvious that it was somebody that she knew.
And it appears that whoever stole from Jane took some of her most precious items. Her wedding ring and a necklace are missing, along with her mobile phone, handbag, and £200. But police find an item they suspect doesn't belong to her.
Behind that bed, between the headboard and the wall, was a baseball cap found on the floor.
It was the designer cap, something that didn't belong to Jane.
The question police want to know is, whose hat is it? And did its owner have anything to do with Jane's death? With the post-mortem results in, it's apparent Jane has suffered a brutal attack.
Really tellingly, she had lacerations, she had tears, both to her anus and to her vagina. The external injuries were really focused around the mouth and the nose and the upper neck area. Ms. Hings didn't have that many injuries on her body, but what there was told a story. There was a little linear graze, a scratch on her neck, and we know that her necklace was missing. It would certainly fit with somebody having pulled that necklace and it scraping across the skin. The most important thing that the post-mortem brought out in itself was that there was no natural cause for her to die. No natural cause for Miss Hings to be dead. In addition, there was some quite disturbing bruising around her jawline, around her mouth, something that really makes you think we have to be sure that this woman hasn't been strangled or smothered.
Less than 24 hours after Jane was discovered, the fast turnaround DNA profile from the tongue bar is returned from the lab.
That profile was put into the DNA database and they soon had a match. They had a hit, and that match was Craig Kehoe.
26-year-old Craig Kehoe's DNA was on file, as he was known to the local police as a petty criminal. Now, he was part of a major manhunt.
Craig Kehoe was a local lad. He grew up in the area. He still lived in the area. Craig led a transient lifestyle. He doesn't have a car, he didn't have a phone, he didn't have a job, he didn't claim benefits. So trying to work out where he lived in the Fleckney area meant we had to do a lot of inquiries at a fast pace, but in a discreet way as well.
Police managed to trace Craig to a caravan which was on the outskirts of Fleckney, but not very far from where Jane lived.
Once we'd identified that he was living in a caravan, we sent officers there.
Someone in the caravan! Police! Open the door! Police, open the door! Someone with a dark hair in there.
And there was a slight standoff of about 30 seconds where the caravan was surrounded and Craig took some time coming to the door before he's arrested.
Right, hands behind back.
Right, at this moment in time, I'm arresting on suspicion of murder. The rest is necessary for prompt and effective investigation. You don't have to say anything. May harm to face. Do not mention one question. Something which you later will learn in the court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand everything I've said to you?
Craig is taken into custody as detectives try to build a picture of the young man they suspect murdered Jane.
He didn't live far from Jane. He was a former factory worker. He'd been in trouble for burglary, a few break-ins and stealing from his parents and from a friend. But he wasn't known as a major criminal. He wasn't known for anything as horrific as this.
As Craig's DNA was identified on the tongue bar and in her bungalow, detectives want to know how it got there. Craig is interviewed under caution.
When was the last time you saw her then?
The last time I saw her was Sunday night.
Okay. What time would that have been?
I got there for about 10:30.
You got there at 10:30?
Yeah.
That's PM?
About 10:30 at night.
At night? Okay. So if we take from 10:30 at night then through to when you left at 11,
Yeah.
tell me exactly in detail what happened.
Well, we was watching a little film on the TV, and then she asked me to have sex with her at the end.
Just tell me exactly what she said to you about having sex.
She just said, "Craig, will you have sex with me?" And then, well, the first time it started off was about a month ago, and I was in the house, and then she just came into the front room naked, and then she was like, "Craig, come and do it with me and I'll pay you."
He offered the reason that his DNA was inside of Jane and inside the scene was because Jane had paid him for sex.
Okay, and how much did she pay you?
Yeah, she paid me £200.
£200.
In the village of Fleckney in Leicestershire, police have arrested 25-year-old Craig Keogh on suspicion of the murder of Jane Hings.
Do not have to say anything. May harm to face. Do not mention one question. Something which you later will learn in the court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand everything I've said to you?
Could this local lad really be responsible for the rape and murder of a 72-year-old pensioner? The news has sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community.
How could somebody that I'd grown up with all these years could be physically capable of doing something like that? I felt sick and it was horrible. Like, who does things like that? To such, you know what I mean? You hear about it, but she was an old lady. She was old. He was a young lad.
Keogh has been taken into custody and is being interviewed under caution. With his DNA found on the victim and at the scene, detectives want to know how Craig knows Jane. And he has an explanation.
I was walking through the village, and I saw this lady, and her shopping bag broke, and I helped her, and then I carried it to the house with her.
Craig told us in an interview that he met Jane when he was down the shops, and that she asked him to pick up some shopping for him and offered him some money for it, and then asked him to walk her dog, Paddy, as well.
But Craig alleges that it wasn't just household chores Jane was paying him for.
And then another time, she's asked me to have sex with her for money. And it happened a month ago, the first time. and then she's asked me to come back, and a month later, and then it happened again.
Key to the police investigation was the tongue piercing found in Jane's groin.
Have you got any piercings?
I got my ear pierced.
Your ear pierced? Okay. Anywhere else?
Yeah, my tongue pierced.
Your tongue?
Craig goes on to admit that he'd been with Jane the night she died, saying he arrived at her house around 10:30 p.m.
Tell me exactly in detail what happened.
Well, I was watching the little film on the TV, and then she asked me to have sex with her again, and she's like, "I'll pay you more this time." I was like, "Okay." I didn't think anything of it, and that was it really. And she said she felt sick, and then I left her.
Craig's detailed account that he had sex with Jane and left her very much alive turns the investigation on its head.
During the course of his interviews, he came up with an explanation as to what happened. I have to say, it was so bizarre.
Craig also suggested that Jane, whilst alive, was unwell when he left.
What he was saying was that she'd become a little bit wobbly and a little bit unwell, and had then gone back to her bed. He'd then closed the door, and obviously whatever happened afterwards was someone else. Some stranger, no doubt having seen that the door was open, would have gone in there, burgled her, and perhaps killed her. And so that might possibly have been an explanation for what happened.
The interviewing officers had to keep an open mind, but had to probe and get as much detail from him as possible to find out whether it was right or not.
Was Craig telling the truth? Was Jane alive when he left? And so was it someone else who sexually assaulted and killed her? Forensics carry out a detailed search for additional DNA or fingerprints on Jane or in the bungalow.
There was nothing else from the scene, from Jane, from the post-mortem which identified anybody else other than Craig. We'd had all of these things examined, and they only pointed at Craig Keogh and did not point to anybody else.
With no one else in the frame, Craig's movements on the night in question are investigated.
Craig had been on a night out in Oadby, a nearby town.
I think it was between 8:30 he came in that night. Remember it well because Leicester City had played Liverpool on that night, so we had a fair few in. He stood out straight away because he had his baseball cap the other way around, and he was just bouncing up and down.
Staff at the pub said that he appeared agitated, aggressive, and almost as if he was up for a fight. They said he was high on drink and drugs.
Now, this was crucially important evidence because in his interviews, he said that by 10:30 that evening, he was sitting in Jane Hing's living room in Fleckney, watching a war film and having a drink with her. That was a lie. He was out with his friends. We were able, by that process, to show that he'd taken cocaine, that he was offering to sell other people cocaine, and that he was complaining about how boring the evening was.
As doubt is cast on Keogh's version of events, police trace his movements after he leaves the pub. He's next seen arriving back in Fleckney at just after 1 a.m.
His friends say that the last time they saw him was when the taxi dropped him off and they assumed he was going home.
But Keogh walks in the opposite direction of his caravan, heading in the direction of Jane's bungalow.
We knew from CCTV that the suspect had walked to Jane's house wearing a baseball cap, and when they were walking away, they didn't have it on, and we could see that.
Detectives believe this places Keogh in Jane's bungalow around 1:15 a.m. And when he returns home, he's captured again.
We see him going back into his caravan, carrying something. Now, he goes out again, and he returns out around 2:30 in the morning for another 15 minutes or so, and we are certain that he went back to Jane Hing's house in that period of time. We don't know what he did.
The following morning, Craig is again seen on camera.
The morning after he was seen walking along the street, he was captured on CCTV with a black bin bag.
He's spotted again a few minutes later, but the bag has vanished. What did he dispose of? The police believe it was some of Jane's belongings, but a search of the area reveals nothing.
This is HFM.
It's 5 o'clock. This is HFM News. Detectives have been given more time to continue questioning a man on suspicion of murder following the discovery of a pensioner dead in her bungalow in Fleckney on Sunday morning. Officers also believe items were stolen from Miss Hings's bungalow in a black bin liner. They're appealing for villagers to check their gardens and outbuildings in case it's been discarded there. A post-mortem examination has so far failed to identify her cause of death.
With help from the public and CCTV, police are able to piece together Keogh's movements 24 hours after Jane's death. Friends described Craig as splashing his cash, buying them drinks and himself a new tongue bar.
He tried to get rid of Jane's jewellery in trying to sell it. He got rid of her handbag. He was trying to get rid of every last bit of evidence that would connect him to Jane.
He went into Leicester city centre and he actually went to a pawnbroker's. He sold her jewellery for about £100 when the items of jewellery were valued around £1,000.
With enough evidence that Keogh stole items from Jane and had raped her, detectives also believe they have a killer on their hands. But proving he murdered Jane was going to be their biggest challenge.
So far as murder was concerned, we had no cause of death. We were unable to show how she died, whether it was deliberate or accidental, forensically at that stage.
In the village of Fleckney, 25-year-old Craig Keogh has been charged with burglary, murder, and the rape of pensioner Jane Hings. The news that Jane was sexually assaulted in her home has been made public.
The community were on edge already, knowing that an old lady had been murdered in her home, but then once the true nature of it came out, people were really worried.
When I found out that information, it just floored me. It played on my mind all night. You know, a woman of that age, how, why could that happen?
I'd say the villagers would be distressed because a majority of them are similar sort of age to Miss Hinks. And you know, and there's quite a few vulnerable people out there as well, and it obviously upset them, but also put a bit of fear into them as well, that this could happen on their doorstep.
Within days of his arrest, Keogh is brought before a judge and the charges read.
He pleaded not guilty to all the charges, so that was murder, 2 counts of rape and burglary.
Keogh is remanded in custody and a date set for his trial. But the work of the prosecution is only just beginning.
This was horrific violence perpetrated on a very frail old lady whilst she was still alive. And there was then the added complication of trying to prove how she died.
So one of Craig Keogh's lines of defence actually referred to him knowing Jane Hings, and he said that she paid him for sex, and that was a reason that he went around and he claimed she was still alive when he left her bungalow on that night.
Experts believe that Jane has been smothered with a pillow, and proving it was Keogh is imperative to the case.
The DNA on the pillows was of saliva, and so we could show that Jane's saliva was on the pillows. That was all.
Typically with a material object, you can't get fingerprints from it. And it's really difficult. For us as investigators, we sat there believing that the pillowcases were our murder weapon. How could we prove that?
With concern that Keogh might get away on a technicality, the police and prosecution reach out to forensic specialists.
Now, our pillowcases had been sat in the bottom of an evidence bag, sat in an exhibit store for, at this point, 4 months. They weren't laid out flat like you'd see in a movie or anything like this. This is a pillowcase shoved in the bottom of an evidence bag.
But as we got nearer to trial, we discovered a new scientific development.
Leicestershire Police said to me they had a pillowcase that they were interested in trying to develop some fingerprints on. They wanted to know whether a novel process I'd been researching was appropriate for this type of exhibit. I recommended that they tried vacuum metal deposition, and I also directed them towards Gloucestershire Police, who had a vacuum metal deposition machine that they could use and a trained operator, which is probably the best technique that we're aware of that gives you a chance of getting fingerprints on fabrics.
Vacuum metal deposition involves vaporizing gold and zinc in a vacuum chamber. The metallic particles are attracted to the fabric and form a negative image of finger marks wherever it has been touched.
So what you have here is the image of the pillowcase as it's come out of the vacuum metal deposition machine. These dark regions where you have quite a lot of zinc deposition, and you have these light regions where zinc simply hasn't deposited. It shows whereabouts the pillowcase has been gripped, and it also enables you to say, well, it's been touched there, so you can then target other techniques such as DNA recovery for those techniques.
We were able, therefore, to show that the pillow had been held in a position that you wouldn't hold a pillow ordinarily in order to put it over Jane Hing's head to kill her.
So that proved our murder weapon. We had Keogh's finger marks on the short edge and Jane's saliva in the middle of the pillow.
But the question is, would it be enough to convict Keogh? The trial begins at Birmingham Crown Court, and Jane's friends come face to face with Keogh.
Craig was just deadpan through the whole entire time. Not an ounce of remorse, not any kind of emotion. He showed nothing.
When Craig sat in the dock, he was expressionless. It was difficult to really see any signs of emotion.
Obviously, Jane's friends are of her age, so are a lot older and didn't want to go and sit through all of that. So I went and sat for her. I didn't want Craig to think that nobody cared about her. I wanted to be seen that, you know, she meant something to somebody.
Craig had denied all along that he was responsible for raping and murdering Jane Hings. In fact, his version of events was at complete odds with the prosecution's case, the police case. He had said that he had gone to see Jane to have sex. He said that they had watched a film together that night, a war film. Checks were made, and there was no war film on TV. It was a complete and utter lie.
As the trial unfolds, the defence tried to paint a picture of Jane.
Craig Keogh was describing Jane Hings as being a sexually promiscuous, drunken woman who liked nothing more than spending her pension money on having intercourse with a young man. We discovered she didn't drink alcohol. There was no alcohol in her bloodstream after her death.
So the jury were then shown all the mobility aids that Jane had in the house, the fact that she couldn't walk between rooms without needing a walking stick or a frame.
So the idea of her being interested in active sexual activity was laughable.
Central to the prosecution case is proving that the sexual contact was non-consensual.
So we instructed an expert in sexual injuries to examine her body. And as a result of that, we were able to show that the sexual activity was not consensual activity, and it would have caused her significant amounts of pain, and it happened when she was alive.
And it was for this reason they believe Keogh decided to kill Jane.
She must have cried out when that happened, and he must have wanted not to be caught and to complete the act. And we know he did complete the act because there was semen within her body. And I expect that during the course of that sexual assault upon her, he decided to kill her because she wouldn't shut up.
Establishing that Keogh had the motive and opportunity to kill Jane, the prosecution introduces what they believe is the murder weapon.
The scientists went the extra mile on this one because they could show that finger marks left by Keogh were on the short, straight edges at the side, and they were gripped like this and applied. And they then took it one step further to look for the amylase staining, that's the protein staining in the middle, to show that Jane had exhaled a lot and given out a lot of moisture from her breath, indicating that that's where she was smothered. And then when the scientists came to court to explain it, the jury was sat there like, oh wow, this is really impactful.
With the prosecution evidence built against him, Keogh remained silent.
Craig sat there very quiet. He chose not to give evidence. He chose not to be cross-examined by prosecutor, and he showed no remorse, even when the horrific details were read out of what he had done.
Craig Keogh could not offer any evidence which the jury could look at and say that he was not guilty. He couldn't offer any alibi, and he couldn't offer any plausible explanation as to why this had happened or why he was suspected of it.
After 5 days, the jury is sent to deliberate. Presented with all the evidence, they have to decide whether the marks at the edge of the pillow and all the new scientific data prove that the young man in front of them is a murderer.
There are two choices for a jury here. Either he went into that house and raped her and burgled the property and then left, and a random stranger came in and smothered her, or the person who raped her smothered her. That's the choice.
Even though you've listened to the whole trial and you know he's guilty, that evidence says he's guilty, those minutes, hours of waiting to hear them words, it's still nerve-wracking, you know, because they could come back with not guilty.
After 4 hours, the jury returns.
They came back and unanimously said that he was guilty of 2 counts of rape, murder and burglary.
When the jury came back, he was plainly shocked. Craig Keogh stood there, and when sentence was imposed, he stood there with an element of resignation, but he didn't seem at any stage to show any kind of remorse. No sadness for her, no sadness for his own family, who appeared to be very decent people. From the beginning to the end, it seemed to me he was entirely focused on himself.
Keogh was given a life sentence and will only be eligible for parole after 32 years. But for all involved, this case has taken its toll.
When I went into Jane Hing's house, I was struck by the peace and tranquility in which she'd lived her life. She was a very simple lady. Beside her bed on one side was her Bible and a crucifix. And on the other side, as she had gone to bed, no doubt like every other night, she'd left her teeth on the side of the bed. And imagining just being in your own bedroom, in the comfort of your own home, and having a young, strong man, plainly intoxicated and under the influence of drunks, coming into your room about 1:15 in the morning, waking you from your sleep, must have been terrifying. That, I think, stays with me.
This case will stick with me. It's one that the community will remember for a long time. It's one that the police officers who went to will remember for a long time.
I've covered numerous murder trials over the last 25 years. The rape of anyone is distressing, it's shocking, but this was particularly shocking because it involved the rape of an elderly woman.
I've been asked many times, what are my feelings towards Craig? And I have none, is the simple answer. I don't hate him because that's an emotion. I literally have no emotion towards him. But to think of what he did, it broke my heart to try and think about the fear that would have been going through her mind at the time. And then to be smothered with her own pillow. Jane was cremated and I put her ashes in an urn that sits on my mantelpiece so she can watch over Paddy every day until the day that he sadly joins her, in which case I will get him cremated and scatter their ashes someplace nice. Are you gorgeous? So they can be together again.
Stranger danger is rare but not impossible. The chilling Murdered at First Sight is new Wednesday at 9 on Sky Mix.
Emergency, how can I help you?
It was a violent, frenzied and very, very aggressive attack. It almost severed his head.
If members of the public have any information at all, this was an 83-year-old family man. It was a brutal attack with no known motive at this time.
It's such a quiet and peaceful place. It just seemed incredible it could happen here.
This was the biggest manhunt.
From the instant I saw him, I realised he didn't fit in. I do regret not following him to see where he went.
Can you explain to me why your DNA is on that
man? East Harling, a quaint village nestled in the heart of the South Norfolk countryside.
It's a lovely little place to live in. It's really quiet, but it's got a lot of sense of community. A lot of pockets of very different helpful people, sports, and there's a couple of pubs.
Really nice place to live, safe place really. You know, everyone a lot of people know each other around here.
With its bountiful forests and country walks to enjoy a quieter pace of life, Harling and its neighbouring villages are the perfect places for many to set up home.
People usually say hello to you and you can stop and have a conversation. A lot of dog walkers in the area, of which I'm one. And, you know, they definitely always speak. Pass the time of day with you.
Harling Heath, a really, really nice place to walk, and we use it for biking, running and dog walking.
The Heathlands, on the edge of the villages, has long been a draw for dog walkers. But this idyllic setting was shattered early one morning when a body was discovered in brambles on the heath.
emergency? How can I help you?
He was found by a couple that were walking their dogs. They saw his dogs walking without anyone, and then as they approached the scene, they could see some blood on the ground and his body partly covered by some brambles just off the pathway. The police were called.
I just remember it was a Saturday, I was at home, and I just remember hearing these police sirens screaming through the village.
I didn't actually come till the afternoon and arrived here. So all these police cars, all these police cars around for us, but it's quite bizarre.
Rumours about the discovery of a body in undergrowth fly through the villages.
An initial assessment suggested that he may have been subject to an animal attack.
One early theory was an attack from an animal, and that was mainly led from the extent of the injuries. Obviously, there's Banham Zoo, not a huge distance away.
I was very sceptical of that because we know what's in the woods, and I can't think of a wild animal that had been over there to do such damage, to kill somebody. There isn't animals over there to do that.
The news spreads among the local dog walking community. Could a wild animal really have attacked and killed a man on their doorstep?
There was a sense of fear, but that kind of not really believing it was going on in the village.
I think it was a bit of a shock to everybody. And it's not something that happens in this area. It certainly put us off walking our dogs there for a while. I had a young daughter at the time, she was only 3, and I wasn't keen on taking her there, you know.
Rookie journalist Zach Ward was one of the first to get wind of the story.
So at the time, I felt shocked, I felt surprised. This was my first job in journalism. It was our goal to try and handle it sensitively. The stories we normally covered at This Express were very community-based. They were human interests. It was about council tax going up. It was people's 100th birthdays. It was that level of local news. So when we say things like this don't happen, that's not a cliche, it's genuine. We had really very little experience in covering this major event.
Police finally identify the body in the woods as 83-year-old Peter Wrighton. But who is he?
Mr. Wrighton was retired. He lived with his wife. He had 2 dogs, one 13 and one 9 or 10 years old, that he walked regularly.
He had retired to Banham, which is about 5 miles as the crow flies to East Harling. He'd worked for BT for 35 years. He'd been married for 59 years, and he sounded like a gentle, kind, loving man. Loved his dogs. He was walking with Gemma and Dylan at the time, and they both stayed with the body, which I think that tells you the bond between dog and owner. But he sounded like a really well-respected member of the community, and we got an outpouring of tributes and sympathy once his name had been released.
The first time we moved in, we went and introduced ourselves to the neighbours. Peter and Anne were very, very welcoming. One of our first things to do was to invite them over for a meal.
They were always friendly. You'd go over there, they're always welcome to. And obviously they used to take their dogs out for a walk, both of them. And they loved dogs, and they took in a lot of rescue dogs.
Father of 2, Peter was a daily visitor with his 2 dogs to the Heath, just a few miles from his home in Banham. Tragically, on the morning of his death, his wife Anne had gone in search of him when he hadn't returned home.
Been shopping, and on my way back, I was driving by, and Anne pulled out her car and drove towards Harling. I thought that was rather unusual for her to go out and leave the house empty without them being out together. I didn't think much more of it than that.
Mr. Wrighton had failed to return home, and Mrs. Wrighton became concerned and actually drove out to the Heath to look for her husband in case possibly he'd had a medical event or become lost. As she approached the scene, she made herself known to the police, who were already there.
While Peter's wife is escorted home, his body is taken for a post-mortem examination to verify the cause of death.
When the post-mortem took place, it was established that he had received quite a violent attack, probably initially from behind. Many of the stabbing injuries were to the back of his neck and a cut across his throat that actually cut all the way back to the spinal column. May have taken 4 or 5 sideways cuts. It almost severed his head. There were other significant injuries, a stab wound that went into his left eye.
The result immediately changes the course of the investigation.
We had a phone call from Anne informing us that Peter had been murdered.
But what had gone on? Why would someone want to kill such a well-respected member of the community in such a violent way? In the quaint countryside of East Harling, a post-mortem examination has just revealed that far from being killed by a wild animal, much-loved pensioner Peter Wrighton had been murdered. But why?
I think someone may have put a suggestion forward that it could have been as a result of an animal attack. But when you consider the circumstances, it would appear the way he had been deposited, he had been dragged backwards and his arms were on top of him, which would be unlikely if he was pulled there by an animal.
Mr. Wrighton had been stabbed over 40 times, including some very deep wounds to his throat, which had almost severed his head from the rest of his body.
It was a violent and aggressive attack with only one outcome likely with the way that he was attacked.
Immediately, a murder investigation is launched to track down the killer. And everyone is a potential suspect.
This was the biggest manhunt for a long, long time.
We've got additional officers in the local area at the scene of the murder. We've also increased our patrols and our police visible presence in and around East Harling.
They were very present, patrolling up and down the road. There was mounted police going around the village on horseback.
At the back of the forest here, the police stopped me all the cars and asking you, what were you on that day, were you here, taking your name, your address and so forth.
Police officers involved in the investigation will have been looking for dog walkers in the area. People have routines and return to places quite regularly, and therefore they will also have people on the heath at the same time, the same day, several days after, to pick up those who regularly go and may have been there in the morning.
As the police were searching the crime scene here, they cut all the grass down really short. All this field was cut very short. All the hedgerow here was cut down to virtually nothing. I guess they're looking for the weapon, I guess.
As news spreads throughout the local dog-walking community that there's a killer at large, so does the fear.
When the murder investigation started, nobody was walking the dogs over the woods. They didn't know who it was.
When people first found out about the murder, then I think it was one of complete disbelief that something like that had happened in the area. And then I think probably naturally mixed in with a bit of fear around who was this person that had committed the crime and were they still at large.
I mean, this was in broad daylight. This was at 10:30 in the morning, potentially. So I think afterwards people were wary. I think people were wary about walking their dogs on their own.
Police established that the 5th of August 2017, started out like any other day for Peter Wrighton.
It was a very typical day for him. He'd been to the shop earlier, he was walking his dogs.
Peter was picked up on CCTV at a local shop at 9:57 a.m. His car was spotted at 10:14 a.m, heading to the heathland to walk his 2 dogs. 30 minutes later, his body was discovered.
Police emergency, how can I help you?
Mr. Wrighton's wallet was still on him. His car keys were still with him, making it unlikely that it was a robbery. The Heath really is a friendly area that people go for relaxation and just to walk dogs and just to get out and get some fresh air, etc. It's not somewhere where you would expect this level of violence.
Another potential theory was around other uses of the area. One dog walker who had used the area quite regularly had mentioned to police that he thought there was suspicious activity involving drugs and people buying drugs around that area.
Police quickly rule out a robbery gone wrong. So who would want to cause this quiet, friendly pensioner harm?
The majority of murders occur between people who know each other. And so an initial line of inquiry would be to establish those people who know him and anyone who may have any sort of grudge or dislike or whatever for Mr. Wrighton. You tend to work in concentric circles around the victim, and so you look very close and then you gradually branch out and expand your inquiry, eliminating people as you go.
Peter was quite reserved, he was quite quiet, because he was such a kind, gentle soul, and happily married to Anne. It didn't make any sense. How could somebody be so wicked? Do you pick on somebody so kind, so loving?
His son and daughter live away and could be easily established as not having been in the Norfolk area, so that would eliminate those family members. And therefore the police then need to look further outside the family unit and expand their inquiries.
You know, we tried to think about people that knew all of us. Could it be anybody that we knew?
Any other significant friendships or relationships before his move to the area?
And we came up with no's everywhere, so it had to be random.
With no obvious clues in Peter's past, police turned to the media and the public for help.
If members of the public have any information at all, even if people think this is a small snippet of information, tell us, because it might be a small bit of information that's the final piece of the jigsaw that we need. We're really, really keen for anybody that was in and around the area between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. on Saturday the 5th of August. This was an 83-year-old family man. It was a brutal attack with no known motive at this time, leaving behind a wife and children.
Another major line of inquiry is through the media to try to gain intelligence from and identify members of the public who may have been in the area at the time.
The police had appealed for information, and the initial amount of people coming forward with information was really, really high. We're talking about the hundreds.
It's important you get to people as soon as possible so that that image is as clear as possible in their minds.
Intensive questioning of local dog walkers starts to give police some leads.
That's the day of the murder. I came up the second day and the policeman said to me, "What are you doing here?" basically. I was a little bit scared because I thought perhaps maybe they would think it was me, because my footprints would be on the soil here and everything, and touch certain things, I guess, so forth. DNA, that sort of stuff, I guess. I don't know how that kind of works, but quite scary at the time.
Didn't sink in at first. And then when they're talking about, it happened such and such, and I thought, well, I was in the forest then.
So as part of the appeals, initially the police were wanting to speak to 2 male individuals and gave very detailed descriptions.
Police rule out the 2 dog walkers. But Peter Bibby is pulled in for questioning.
I had an interview at work, an interview at home, where they took all fingerprints, DNA. That's it.
Good boy.
They even took DNA off the dog, took all my clothes.
Good boy.
Yeah, it was quite harrowing, but I suppose everybody's a suspect till you're proven innocent.
But unknown to Peter, something he had witnessed on the morning of the 5th of August was about to turn the investigation on its head.
It was a normal day over the heath. Met quite a few new people, which was quite nice, a few of the people that I used to know. Yeah, just a really nice, peaceful day. Yeah, this is the route that I took. I regularly walk this ridge, and this gate wasn't there at the time, so I would come along here, and then I turned down, then walked back through the woods in a round circle. Saw somebody walking towards us, and he just didn't look right. He wasn't dressed for walking in the forest. He didn't have a dog. He wasn't with anybody else. It was just totally out of sync.
Through their inquiries, they identified another person who'd been dog walking on the heath at the time, who had spoken to someone who seemed out of place. Didn't seem to be dressed to be walking, didn't have a dog. You know, dog walkers tend to, it's not a uniform they wear, but they tend to dress in similar ways and know who looks in or out of place.
On his feet, he had like heavy-duty flip-flops and a pair of shorts and a T-shirt. Very smartly dressed and was totally out of character for walking dogs in the forest. We were both walking up wheel ruts of a car. So I was walking up the right-hand one, he was coming down the left-hand one. When we actually passed, he was about this far away from me. I could have put my hand out and touched him. If I hadn't said hello to him, he'd have definitely walked past me and wouldn't have given me the time of day. There was no chance of any eye contact, not even any fainted little glances. He had his head forward and he was just walking forward and ignoring everything. And then he went on, and then I was wondering to myself, what's he doing? Where's he going? It's not right.
He provided an e-fit of this person that became very key to the investigation later on.
I do regret not following him to see where he went. Yeah. And that's sort of like bugged me for a while.
Suddenly, police have a description of a man they believe could hold the key as to what went on that morning on the heathland. They release an e-fit. But who is this man? And is he a killer? The rural Norfolk countryside is still reeling 6 days after 83-year-old Peter Wrighton was murdered on the heathland while walking his dog.
Shocking events such as these have a significant impact on the community. One of the first things the local police inspector will do is a community impact assessment to try and reach out to the community and reassure them that the police are doing as much as they can to protect them and to resolve whatever the incident is that's happened.
Such a shock for this area because it's so safe and so sort of old-fashioned in a way. I guess you leave your doors unlocked, you have your keys in your car, and no one expects anyone to get murdered. It's just quite bizarre. Afterwards, people are quite scared of walking the dogs in the forest.
Police still have no suspects, no murder weapon, and no motive.
I think any time there has been a murder in these sort of circumstances and no one's been found, there's likely to be wariness. There's likely to be some people who sadly won't want to leave the house. That shock was always there, I think. It was random, it was unprovoked, it literally could happen to anybody.
It wasn't safe for any of us. If there's a murderer already, it's murdered Peter. Was it something personal or not? We didn't know. After the murder of Peter, I was very reluctant to leave the house.
Having turned to the public for help, police receive information about a man who had stood out on the heath on the morning of the murder.
I just saw his feet first, and I thought he's wearing like heavy-duty flip-flops. It's not the sort of attire that you'd think of going dog walking. Pair of shorts on. Most people don't wear shorts through there because of the nettles, bits of bracken and all sorts of stuff like that. He was walking with a purpose.
Police release an e-fit of the man described, and suddenly there's a breakthrough. Police receive a tip-off about a local man, 24-year-old Alexander Palmer.
So, following the police appeals, a psychiatrist who had worked with Alexander Palmer then came forward with some concerns around previous things that Palmer had said.
The psychologist told the police that when treating Alexander Palmer, he had ideations of violent attacks, often with a knife.
Palmer had talked about his desire to attack random people. The voice in his head he called Little Alex.
Once Alexander Palmer was known to the inquiry, he was allocated to a team of detectives as a person of interest. Having obtained a photograph from Facebook, it was immediately apparent that there was a very strong likeness with the e-fit that had been provided by one of the dog walkers.
So at the time we knew that Palmer was 24 years old and he lived in Cringleford in Norfolk, and he had previously been a part of the armed forces.
Having identified Alexander Palmer as a suspect, an arrest strategy was prepared and he was arrested at 4:40 the following morning.
News of the arrest quickly spreads.
I wasn't sleeping. Quite paranoid about it all. I always kept looking at my iPad, to see if there'd been any updates. And I think there's one at 3 o'clock in the morning, the first published Alexander's name. So I quickly thought I'd have a look at Facebook. And lo and behold, there he was. As soon as I saw him on Facebook, I realised that was him. Without a shadow of a doubt.
After Alexander was arrested, they'd informed Anne, and Anne informed us that someone had been arrested for it, which was a relief for us.
As part of the arrest strategy, having been brought into custody, various forensic samples and a DNA swab will have been taken from Palmer, which will have been fast-tracked to the laboratory to try to get a profile as soon as possible. Having an outstanding profile from Mr. Wrighton's trousers, they need to know as soon as possible whether there could be any link to Alexander Palmer.
With forensic evidence being processed, Palmer himself is brought in for questioning.
Alex, can I get you to introduce yourself, please? Alexander Hobbs Palmer. As I said, an e-fit was prepared from a description. Have a look at that. What would you say about that? That's a pretty good likeness.
Alexander admitted that he had been in the area at the time.
During the first interview, Palmer revealed that he had been in the area. He said that he had travelled there and feeling depressed, he had stood there and had cried to himself and had walked about and then returned to his car, parked somewhere separately and had another walk and then left the area.
He was quite adamant about it, that he had not done it. He was not the killer. There was a Roman road that dissected the wood. Mr. Wrighton had been killed on the west side of the road. Alexander said that he'd been on the east side at all times. I found him to be pretty calm, composed. He was intelligent.
Despite Palmer's denials, on the ground, detectives worked tirelessly to find evidence to link him to the crime.
You're looking for something that will link him to the scene, something that will link him to Mr. Wrighton. So you're going to look for any clothes that have been worn at any locations that he's been to, so a house, lock-up, work, vehicles that he may have used, looking to seize as many items as possible to initially assess them and then send them for forensic examination.
And it isn't long before forensic investigations start to produce results.
It was the second day of interviews that the positive result on the DNA matching Alexander Palmer to the DNA profile found on the trousers, probably where he dragged Mr. Wrighton into the bushes, grabbing his trousers to pull him along.
What could be his DNA was found on Mr. Wrighton's trousers, and what could have been Mr. Wrighton's blood was found on the collar of a jacket that belonged to Alexander.
That was the main evidence to link Alexander Palmer to Peter Wrighton, and obviously that then entered into the interview strategy.
Can you explain to me why your DNA is on that man? I'm afraid I can't without knowing. You don't need to know. It's irrelevant where it is. You say you haven't met him. Why is your DNA on him? For instance, I could have lost a hair follicle and caught on his shoe. That's just me speculating, but without knowing, I couldn't venture a guess. Okay.
Police now have a DNA link between the two men, but need further proof linking Palmer to the crime.
A search of his car identified a map which had markings on it indicating the area of the heath, which is obviously of interest because it indicates some sort of pre-planning before going to the scene.
There was ANPR data, the number plate recognition, which put Palmer at the location at the day of the murder.
Some ANPR evidence had been recovered with Palmer driving his car in the morning when dropping his partner off in the city, which showed him apparently in a white or light-coloured shirt, and when he was seen picking her up in the afternoon, he was seen in a dark-coloured shirt. And yet his account was that he had been wearing the same clothes all day, but he appeared to have changed his clothing, and none of that clothing, which is highly likely to have been heavily bloodstained, was ever recovered.
Police believe they have irrefutable proof that Palmer killed Peter Wrighton, but they still don't know why or what with, and their suspect is now refusing to talk.
I'll ask you again, were you involved in the murder of Peter Wrighton? No comment.
He made it very clear that he was not guilty, was not responsible, and he hadn't done the killing. And that remained his position throughout.
Detectives analyse Palmer's phone records and come across a damning photograph.
It was established that he had bought a hunting-type knife, and in fact there was a picture of it, I think, on his phone. That picture of the knife was shown to the forensic pathologist, who confirmed that it could have caused the injuries.
Alexander Palmer is charged with murder. But what was his motive? And what drove him to kill? February 2018. And Alexander Palmer is standing trial at Nottingham Crown Court, accused of murdering Peter Wrighton in August 2017. A crime which had sent shockwaves through the small, close-knit community of East Harling.
I think my first initial thought was, whoever done this is a coward. The nature of the frenzy that murderer did, it was a cowardly act on an old man who's out walking dogs.
Totally shocked. I couldn't believe it because it's such a quiet and peaceful place. It just seemed incredible it could happen here. Just seemed impossible, really.
Prior to the court case, Palmer has to undergo psychological assessments to determine his capacity to stand trial.
I believe he's initially sent to Belmarsh Prison and then to Rampton for that assessment. And the question to be answered was Alexander Palmer mad or bad? Had he carried out this attack because of a mental illness that he was suffering from, or was he just a very violent and nasty person?
So who is Alexander Palmer?
When I first met Alexander, he was 24 years old. He'd been 23 at the time of the offence. He had no previous convictions, no cautions, no findings of guilt, no reprimands, nothing, so far as the police were concerned, that would suggest that he would commit such a violent offence. He'd served in the British Army till about 2015. He had trained and qualified as a commando, one of the few who actually qualified in his year. But there was one thing of note. In March of 2014, a fellow trainee had stamped on his head, and that was plainly the beginning of his mental problems. Because of that, he had been medically discharged from the army.
Throughout 2015, Palmer was treated as both an inpatient and an outpatient in mental health services, seen by several different psychologists. But one expressed concern to the police after seeing media appeals about the murder.
One of the people that contacted the control room was a psychologist who had worked previously with Palmer following an assault on Palmer whilst he was serving in the forces that had an effect on him.
And one piece of information comes to light which is particularly chilling.
The psychologist told the police that he had a dislike for dog walkers.
Dog walkers, he said, were a particular bugbear of his.
He was obviously suffering some mental health problems brought on by PTSD. He had some kind of grievance with dog walkers is the thing that stands out.
He had made disclosures about ideations around violence and a dislike of dog walkers.
Having been deemed fit to stand trial, the court hears how Alex had revealed on arrest that he heard voices in his head.
Palmer had talked about the voice in his head he called Little Alex.
Is there a different Alex? Times, yes. Okay, who's he? He used to manifest himself as a physical hallucination, but now he's just a voice. Is he still with us? Yes. Is he here today? Yes. Where is he now? What is him here? He's there, is he?
Palmer admits being on the Heathlands on the day of the murder.
So was Alex there that day? The other Alex? He's always there. So he's always there. So he would have been with you, okay? Was he? Do you remember him talking to you on that day? You don't. But you say he talks to you every day. Yes. He's there laughing at you. But you say he doesn't tell you what to do. He doesn't force you to do things or anything like that.
Palmer, during the court case, had said that he had visited the woodland because he was feeling low, but didn't say that he'd been involved in the attack.
But the prosecution puts forward evidence linking Palmer to Peter Wrighton.
Several of Mr. Wrighton's clothes were sent for forensic examination, and they had identified DNA from a person on the leg of his trousers.
I believe there was DNA found on Mr. Wrighton as well, which linked Palmer to the murder.
The court also hears that on the morning of the murder, ANPR cameras picked up Palmer's black Ford Focus on the A11, heading towards the Heath. Mobile phone records reveal he is stationary on the area of the Heath from 10:19 a.m. for a period of 32 minutes and 55 seconds. His car is then picked up heading north on the A11. The whole journey, police believe, had been planned in advance.
A search of his car identified a map with the area marked out.
In fact, investigations reveal Palmer had completed the exact same journey 2 weeks prior to the murder. Had it been a practice run, or had he intended to kill on that day? Either way, it was Peter who found himself at the end of Palmer's wrath on that fateful day.
Why did he pick Peter?
Being that Peter's about my stature and a bit older than I am, Peter was easy prey for Alexander.
But did Peter actually try to help this man? We don't know. Nobody will ever know. Because this man won't say anything now. Did Peter try to help him? Peter suffered for it. We don't know.
It was also revealed that despite his age and smaller stature, Peter had tried to fight off his attacker.
He had what we would refer to as defensive marks on his hand. It would appear that he tried to grab the blade of the knife to stop his assailant.
It was unprovoked, and he was a very, very old man that couldn't defend himself. Alexander's quite a strong lad, you know, military background, very fit and able. Peter Wrighton could hardly stand up. I think very cowardly.
The prosecution revealed further evidence that Palmer had planned to kill. Police had found a notebook in a storage facility belonging to Palmer, in which it appeared he had written of his plans.
So in January of 2015, he said he was thinking of going for dog walkers. He said that he hated dog walkers and that if he did this, he would be up on a pedestal, up with the big ones. Everyone would look up to him. Everyone would know his name.
But while police did discover the notebook, there's one thing they never did find: the knife he used to kill Peter.
The prosecution case would be the steps that he had taken to get rid of any forensic evidence would indicate a knowledge of what he had done and an intention to cover up what he had done.
On the advice of his barrister, Palmer does not give evidence in his trial.
I explained to him that it's his case, his future, his liberty that's at stake, and that we act as a voice for him in the courtroom.
The notebook, DNA, witness statements, and the EFIT, as well as Palmer's medical records, are put to the court.
The prosecution case was a strong one. ANPR evidence in relation to his vehicle and cell site evidence in relation to his phone showed that he had been in the area at the relevant time. In addition to that, there was evidence from 2 eyewitnesses who had given descriptions of the person who was likely to have been Mr. Wrighton's attacker. And those descriptions were quite similar to the appearance of Alexander. One of those 2 witnesses had made an EFIT, and again, the EFIT was quite similar to Alexander's appearance. There was no direct evidence, but if you put all those matters together, it represents quite a strong case.
Having heard all the evidence, the jury retire to consider their verdict.
The trial came to a conclusion and the jury found Alexander Palmer guilty of murder.
When a jury decides after 49 minutes, I think there's obviously overwhelming evidence to suggest that Palmer was the person who carried out the murder. That was the one thing that stood out for me at the trial, is how quickly they decided that Palmer was guilty of the murder.
Despite evidence of Palmer's mental health problems, the judge ruled that he had meticulously planned the murder.
The statutory sentence is life imprisonment, but there is a recommendation from the judge, which in this case was 28 years. I would suggest that the fact that once convicted and imprisoned, he was sent to a normal prison rather than a psychiatric prison indicates that the assessment was that he was a violent and nasty person.
Good girl, good girl. Come on.
The dog walkers of East Harling will never forget the horrifying crime which leaves its mark on this close-knit community.
Not the same in the forest here for months. People were not relaxed, they're very nervous, looking over the shoulder all the time. I was doing the same, actually, looking over your shoulder, seeing what cars were parked here. It was very bizarre, kind of a chilling feeling afterwards.
And for Peter Bibby, his brush with evil will live with him forever.
It was quite a scary thing, and it's all the what ifs. What if I had gone back? You know, would have changed things. I was walking straight forward to him. It could have been me.
Investigate an infamous case stage by stage to appreciate the full picture in OJ Made in America, available now on Sky Documentaries.
One day, my company held an anniversary party. The venue was already bustling with many employees chatting noisily. There were about 30 minutes until the party started, so I sat down on a nearby chair to wait. Then, James approached me. "Hey, you actually showed up. By the way, where's your wife? She's running late because of work." James always pestered me, and honestly, it was getting on my nerves. Why so cold? Does she have some secret job you can't tell anyone about? Come on, show us the wife who matches your dull looks. I was at my limit after he insulted my beloved wife. Right then, someone appeared, throwing the venue into a state of panic. And James, who had been insulting me, started down a path of misfortune. My name is John. I'm 26 years old. After graduating from college, I started working at a trading company. Another person from the same college joined the same company, and his name is James. We joined as peers, but I was shocked by the difference in how we were treated. You see, James is what you'd call a handsome guy. Even I, as a man, had to admit he had model-like good looks and a great build. He's about 6 feet 2 inches tall. James had been popular since college, and that didn't change after joining the company. He was always surrounded by female employees and often had lunch with them. I'm the complete opposite of James. I've been mocked for my looks since I was a kid and have no confidence in myself. So, I've always tried to avoid drawing attention. But James always found a way to pick on me. This had been going on since college when he once humiliated me. It was during the annual Mr. University contest at our university. Known as the Mr. Contest. Our university's Mr. Contest was a big deal, getting a lot of attention on social media. Of course, James entered, but the problem was that someone entered me too. I would never enter myself and had no memory of doing so. Someone must have done it for a laugh. I figured everyone would lose interest eventually, and since I'd get eliminated in the preliminaries, I decided to endure it for a bit. But I made it to the finals. It was obviously rigged. Someone must have tampered with the votes. I tried to withdraw, but since it had been publicized on social media, dropping out midway wasn't allowed. So, I was forced to stand on stage. The person standing next to me in the finals was James. In the final round, the audience votes, and I could hear snickers from the crowd. Of course, there was a huge difference between James and me. As expected, James won. I didn't get a single vote. Later, I found out that it was James who had entered me into the contest and rigged the votes. After the Mr. Contest ended, we were nearing the end of our college life, so I tried to focus on getting through it without worrying too much. Yet, I ended up working at the same company as James. When I found out we were at the same company, I was utterly disheartened. I thought it would be just like college all over again. However, after we started working, James was always busy with female employees fawning over him, leaving him little time to harass me. Even so, he occasionally made snide remarks to me. For instance, when we passed by each other, he would say, "Man, you look ugly today. Did you even check the mirror before coming in?" I couldn't step out looking like that. You know, as a salesman, appearance matters. You should take a leaf out of my book and spruce up a bit. Sure, looks matter in sales. But I believe it's more about expressions than facial features. And above all, in sales, building trust with the client is crucial. I always prioritize trust, so my sales performance was fairly high. James, on the other hand, was the top performer. This was because he mostly dealt with companies led by women. James had a knack for charming women, securing deals just by engaging in a bit of personal talk. Many men didn't think highly of him, but no one could complain about his top sales record. Around 2 years after joining the company, a company-wide drinking party was organized. We were seated in close groups based on age. So I ended up sitting opposite James. Since we had a 3-day weekend coming up, everyone seemed to be drinking at a high pace. James was already drunk by the time he started picking on me again. "So, I hear you're married." "Yeah, so what? But you didn't invite anyone from work to the wedding, did you?" "Isn't that strange?" "Not really. More people are having small, family-only ceremonies these days. You didn't invite anyone because you're too embarrassed to show your wife, right?" "That's not it at all." As I tried to explain, James burst into a crude laugh. "Nobody wants to see your wife anyway." I felt drained, unable to muster a response to James's offensive laughter and remarks. Then, perhaps thinking I was angry, James started saying things like this. "Don't be mad. We were Mr. Contest buddies, remember?" Colleagues around us reacted to his statement. "Mr. Contest?" "Yeah, it's a contest held at our university every year to pick the best-looking guy. And both James and John competed in it?" One colleague inquired with a puzzled look. "Yep. It's hilarious that this guy entered the Mr. Contest. And we went head-to-head in the finals. Of course, all the votes went to me. And he got 0. At that moment, I truly hated James. Our colleagues looked uncertain how to respond and quickly changed the subject. The rest of the drinking party was hellish for me. After the Mr. Contest topic came up, I didn't speak to anyone, drinking alone in a corner. Honestly, I started thinking about changing jobs. But the reason I've been able to endure at this company is because of my wife. I'm home. I was heavily intoxicated from all the stress drinking and stumbled into the house completely drunk. My wife, Emma, welcomed me home with a smile. "Welcome back. How was the drinking party today?" "It was awful. I never want to attend another one." "Was it because of James again?" "Yeah. He always picks on me. I don't know why. You're good at your job, so maybe he's jealous deep down. I hope that's it, but he embarrassed me in front of everyone. That must have been tough. Let's just go to bed early and do something fun tomorrow to take your mind off it." "Yeah, maybe we should go on a day trip." "Sounds great. I have the day off tomorrow, so we can have fun from morning till night." Emma's smile saves me. I used to be gloomy and negative, but since meeting Emma, I've become a bit more positive. Emma is a very cheerful woman, always full of energy. Just seeing her makes me feel better. She's more than I deserve, balancing both work and household chores. Whenever I come home, there's always a warm meal waiting in Emma's smiling face. No matter how bad my day at work is, I recharge when I get home. The only thing Emma isn't good at is ironing. I've asked her to iron my shirts a few times, but she ended up burning them or putting holes in them, so I handle the ironing. Emma felt bad about it, saying, "I'm sorry. I ruined your work shirts. I thought a good wife should be able to iron properly. But I can't do it at all. But in a marriage, you cover each other's weaknesses. So I didn't mind it at all. Besides, ironing isn't a big deal. For someone like me who isn't good at cooking or cleaning, having Emma around is a blessing." I fell asleep feeling grateful for Emma. The next day, we went on a day trip to a hot spring. We enjoyed good food, relaxed in the hot spring, and felt ready to tackle work again. After a refreshing 3-day weekend, I was informed about the company's anniversary party. We'd had opportunities to hold the anniversary party before, but due to various issues like the pandemic and our president's health, this was the first actual event. Honestly, I didn't want to attend. The anniversary party has a tradition of bringing spouses. It's not mandatory, but most people bring their spouses or children. Since I'm married, my boss told me to bring my wife. I didn't want to take Emma, mainly because I didn't want her to meet James. You're not going to leave your wife at home, are you? She's busy with work, so I don't know if she can make it. Sure, just say she's busy so you don't have to bring her. I lost my temper at James's remark. Fine, I'll bring her. Wow, scary. I'm looking forward to it then. I bet your wife is just like you. That night, I told Emma about the anniversary party. I can make it that day. I might be a bit late because of work, though. That's totally fine. I'm sorry to drag you into this. Don't worry about it. I've been curious. About what?